Section 1. The episode Fox buried for 4 years. There is something about the late hours that makes hidden things feel closer. When the rest of the world has quieted down and you are lying here in the dark, the stories that were never supposed to be told have a way of finding you. Settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you somewhere most people never go. Into the back rooms of one of television's most controversial animated shows, where the episodes they tried to bury, the conspiracies that refuse to die, and the secrets hiding inside 25 years of animated comedy are waiting to be uncovered. We are going to spend the next few hours talking about Family Guy. Not the Family Guy you see every time you scroll through a streaming service. We are talking about the version of the show that executives panicked over in darkened conference rooms. The episodes that never made it to air, or barely made it, or made it and caused international incidents nobody involved was prepared for. The theories that fans have spent years constructing about what the show is really about beneath its bright, chaotic, endlessly loud surface. The predictions so accurate they made people stop and wonder whether the writers had access to information the rest of us simply did not have. This is the hidden side of a show that has been on television since the 31st of January 1999. A show that premiered to 22 million viewers after the Super Bowl, got canceled twice, came back from the dead twice, and is now locked into a renewal deal that keeps it running through 2028 and into its 30th anniversary. A show that has outlasted almost every cultural moment it ever referenced. A show whose creator once wrote the characters, voiced the characters, and breathed life into every single frame, and whose slow withdrawal from that creative control may be the most genuinely interesting conspiracy hiding in plain sight across the entire run. But we begin where all great forbidden stories begin. With the moment someone looked at something that had been made and decided the public should not see it. In the year 2000, Family Guy was still in the early, fragile stage of its existence. The show had premiered to enormous numbers the previous year and built a genuine, enthusiastic following among young adult viewers who found in it a kind of anarchic intelligence they were not getting anywhere else on broadcast television. But Fox was still nervous about it. Still unsure whether this crude animated comedy from a young creator named Seth MacFarlane was a long-term investment or a novelty that would burn itself out before the first contract cycle ended. The network was hovering over the show, watching, ready to pull the plug if it caused too much damage. In the year 2000, what they decided to pull was an episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. It had been written by a writer named Ricky Blitt, directed by Dan Povenmire, and assigned production code 2ACX05, placing it in the second season. The original plan was to air it in December of 2000, likely timed to the Hanukkah holiday. The episode featured Peter Griffin getting conned out of the family's savings by an insurance salesman who convinces him to invest in volcano insurance. Left with nothing, Peter arrives at a conclusion that only Peter Griffin could arrive at. What he needs is a Jewish accountant. Because in Peter's cosmically simplified worldview, Jewish people are just naturally better with money. That is the setup. That is the entire joke the episode hangs on. Fox executives read the script and quietly began to panic. Their concern was that the humor would be perceived as anti-Semitic rather than as satire of the ignorance that produces stereotypes in the first place, and that the network would face serious backlash from organizations with the power to make that controversy very expensive. They shelved the episode. It sat in a vault, fully produced, fully animated, with a completed song and dance number and celebrity voice work already recorded. Ben Stein played Rabbi Goldberg. Mark Hamill appeared as both Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi in a cutaway. Ed McMahon played himself. Optimus Prime was revealed to be Jewish. Every frame was finished, every joke was timed, and none of it was allowed to air. The episode would remain buried for 3 years. Think about that timeline. 3 years is a long time in television. The show itself got canceled and came back in that window. The world changed in ways nobody in a Fox executive suite in December of 2000 could have predicted. But the episode sat waiting, fully finished, locked away. When Adult Swim acquired the Family Guy rerun rights in 2003, they got access to the vaulted episode and aired it for the first time on the 9th of November 2003, over 3 years after it had been completed and sitting ready to go. Fox themselves did not air it until the 10th of December 2004. When they finally did, they made changes. The most significant was to a song called I Need a Jew, which Peter sings to the exact melody of When You Wish Upon a Star from Disney's Pinocchio, hence the episode title. In the original DVD version, the song contained the lyric, "Though by many they're adored, Hebrew people I've adored. Even though they killed my Lord, I need a Jew." Fox changed that final lyric to, "I don't think they killed my Lord," before broadcast, softening the line without removing the joke entirely. When the episode finally aired and people actually watched it, most did not find it particularly offensive. The satire was clearly coming from Peter's ignorance rather than from any authorial contempt for Jewish people. The whole joke, from the first scene to the last, is that Peter is wrong. Max Weinstein, the Jewish accountant Peter befriends, is a decent, professional, entirely ordinary man. Not a wizard with numbers, not superhuman, just a competent professional doing his job. Peter's assumption that there is something cosmic or mystical about Jewish financial acumen is the source of the comedy, and by the end of the episode, his misconceptions are gently and clearly corrected. The point was that ethnic stereotypes are a product of ignorance, and that ignorance in the right comedic framing is always the butt of its own joke. McFarlane, when Adult Swim aired the episode in 2003, appeared in a brief promotional clip and said this was the episode Fox refused to air because they felt it was too risky. He then added with dry amusement that, in this case, too risky apparently meant anything that did not feature a celebrity standing next to a car wearing very little. The story did not end there. 3 years after it finally aired, the episode became the subject of a lawsuit from a music publishing company called Born Co., which owned the rights to When You Wish Upon a Star. Born Co. argued that I Need a Jew was not a legitimate parody, but a near-identical copy of the original melody that caused harm to the reputation of a culturally beloved song. Fox and McFarlane fought it. In 2009, Judge Deborah Batts ruled in favor of Family Guy, finding that I Need a Jew qualified as protected parody under fair use principles. She wrote that it was precisely the song's positive and magical associations that made it an effective parody target, because parody derives its power from subverting something the audience already holds in regard. The irony of the entire situation is considerable. Fox spent 4 years afraid to air an episode that, once people watched it, most thought was perfectly serviceable satire. The lawsuit spent additional years arguing over a parody the courts ultimately protected, and the episode itself has since been largely forgotten in the broader cultural memory of the show, overshadowed by things Family Guy would later do that were genuinely more provocative. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was not the most controversial episode of Family Guy. It was simply the first one to get caught. That dynamic, a network fearing content that turns out far less explosive than imagined, would repeat itself throughout the show's history. And nowhere does it play out more dramatically than in the story of the one Family Guy episode that has still, to this day, never aired on American television. Before we get there, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. I love knowing these videos reach people in different parts of the world at all hours of the night. And if you have not subscribed yet, the button is right there and it costs nothing. Now, let us talk about the episode that actually broke the system. Section 2. The episode that has never aired in America. There is a particular kind of silence around something that has genuinely been buried. Not the silence of something forgotten, because things get forgotten all the time, and that has a softness to it. This is the silence of something deliberately held back. Something that exists, fully formed, and that you are simply not allowed to see in your own country. That is a harder kind of silence. More deliberate, more political, more frustrating the longer you think about what it really means. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It is Season 8, Episode 21 of Family Guy. It was written by Danny Smith, directed by Joseph Lee, and it is the only episode in the entire history of the show that has never aired on any American television network. Not Fox, not Adult Swim, not Comedy Central, not FXX, not local syndication. It is not available on Hulu. It was not available on Disney Plus for the longest time, even though Disney Plus hosts virtually every other episode the show has produced. If you want to watch it in the United States, your options have been essentially limited to a DVD box set. Think about what that actually means. A show that has aired content involving a baby who repeatedly tries to murder his own mother as a running joke across multiple seasons, graphic cartoon violence played for laughs, and jokes about every sensitive cultural topic imaginable. That show has exactly one episode it cannot put on American television, and that episode is about abortion. Here is what happens in it. Lois Griffin, at a college reunion, reconnects with her old friend Naomi. Naomi and her husband Doug have been struggling to conceive a child for years. They have worked through every available medical option without success. Naomi approaches Lois and asks her to be their surrogate mother, to carry a pregnancy for them using in vitro fertilization. This is not a casual ask. It is the kind of request that comes from someone who has genuinely run out of other options. Lois agrees. She goes through the medical procedure over Peter's self-centered objections. Peter's discomfort is less about ethics and more about the personal inconvenience of having a pregnant wife carrying someone else's child, which is entirely on brand for Peter Griffin. Lois becomes pregnant with Naomi and Doug's biological child. Then Naomi and Doug are killed in a car accident. Lois is now pregnant with a child whose biological parents are both dead. She has to decide whether to carry the pregnancy to term and give the baby up for adoption or to have an abortion. Peter, initially supportive of abortion in the reflexive way he approaches most things he has not had to actually think about, becomes vehemently opposed after an encounter with protesters outside a clinic who show him graphic imagery and speak to him in emotionally manipulative terms. He reverses his position entirely and begins pressuring Lois. The show portrays this reversal accurately as being driven by emotional manipulation rather than genuine moral reasoning. Peter has not thought it through. He has been pushed. The episode does not let the audience forget that distinction. Lois, meanwhile, goes through the genuine emotional weight of the decision on her own terms. She considers what she owes to herself, to her family, to the memory of Naomi and Doug. She does not arrive at her decision quickly. When she does arrive at it, the show does not present it as triumphant or as tragic. It is simply her choice, made by her. At the end of the episode, Lois has the abortion. Not in a graphic way, not designed to shock. The show handles the subject with more structural care and more genuine narrative architecture than it manages in the vast majority of its episodes. The decision is reached through something approaching real character motivation, rather than a shortcut. For an animated comedy that routinely resolves complex moral situations with a quick cutaway, this is genuinely notable. Kevin Riley, who was president of Fox Entertainment at the time, was asked to explain the decision not to air the episode. He said it was an extremely fragile subject matter at an extremely fragile economic time, and called abortion the one issue that seems to be the most of a hot button. He also said something revealing. It was not that the episode took a side. It was that any episode about abortion at all would generate a category of controversy that Fox was not willing to absorb, regardless of how responsibly it was handled. That is an important and unusually honest admission. Fox was not claiming the episode was bad television. They were saying the subject itself, approached in any way, carried political liability that a broadcast network operating at Fox's scale could not easily manage. The episode does not tell the audience that abortion is right or wrong. It shows a woman making a deeply personal decision under extraordinary circumstances and allows her to make that decision without punishing her for it. In a political environment where reproductive choice is treated as a binary ideological war rather than a complicated human experience, the simple act of depicting a woman having an abortion and not immediately being destroyed by the consequences was apparently too much for broadcast television. The comparison between what got through and what did not is genuinely illuminating. An episode where Peter accidentally joins a terrorist organization aired without incident. An episode where Brian campaigns to legalize marijuana and the show essentially argues for drug policy reform aired without incident. A two-part episode where Stewie murders Lois in graphic detail, revealed to be a computer simulation, aired without incident. But the episode where Lois carefully thinks through a difficult ethical decision and makes a private choice about her own body sits in a vault. In June of 2010, BBC Three in the United Kingdom gave the episode its world premiere in a Sunday night primetime slot. Over 1 million households in the UK watched it. Reviews were mostly positive, with critics noting it was a more substantive piece of storytelling than much of what the show was producing during that period. That same year, The episode was released on DVD in the United States on the 28th of September 2010, so Americans could legally purchase it and watch it at home on a disc. They simply could not have it broadcast to them through the infrastructure Fox and its affiliated networks controlled. The episode has a perfect ending for a story this politically fraught. The final scene shows the Griffin family at the dinner table in an ordinary domestic moment. Lois says she has something to tell everyone. Peter turns directly to camera and announces flatly, "We had the abortion." Then the episode ends. Immediately. Abruptly. It cuts to black before any family member can respond. Before the audience can be given any emotional resolution. No catharsis, no lesson, no tidy family moment. Just the fact, delivered in Peter's flat voice, and then silence. For a show that typically wraps its stories in a bow, the ending of partial terms of endearment is startlingly and deliberately unresolved, which is perhaps the most honest possible ending for a subject that genuinely resists being resolved neatly. 15 years after it was produced, the episode remains unaired in America. The political conversation around its central subject has not softened. There is no sign any American network plans to change their position. And so it remains, not quite buried because it exists and can be found by anyone who looks, but not quite free either. A story told in full somewhere across the ocean, locked behind a door on this side that has been closed for more than a decade and a half. Section 3. PTV. The episode about censorship that got censored. There are moments in television history where a show turns the camera directly on the system that controls it, and those moments carry a particular charge because everyone involved knows what is actually being said beneath the surface of the comedy. The Family Guy episode called PTV is one of those moments. It aired on the 6th of November, 2005, in the 4th season, and it is one of the most self-aware and politically pointed things the show ever produced. It is also, with irony so perfect it almost seems constructed, an episode that Fox's own internal censors forced significant changes onto before it could reach its audience. An episode about the absurdity and overreach of television censorship was itself censored by the network airing it. The setup came from a real event, the Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction during the Super Bowl halftime show in 2004. That incident, a split second of unintended nudity during a broadcast watched by approximately 140 million Americans, caused the Federal Communications Commission to dramatically increase its scrutiny of broadcast content. The FCC began levying massive fines. Proposed fines against Fox for prior Family Guy content reached $1.2 million. The Parents Television Council, which had been publicly naming Family Guy the worst show on network television for years, flooded the FCC with complaints. MacFarlane and his writing staff were genuinely and extensively furious about what this meant for the show's creative future. The episode they wrote in response was a direct argument for free expression dressed up as a Family Guy story. After a wardrobe malfunction at the Emmy Awards prompts the FCC to begin censoring all of Peter's favorite television shows beyond recognition, Peter retaliates by setting up his own station out of the family home called PTV, broadcasting uncensored classic programming and original content. Quagmire hosts a late-night variety show. Brian and Stewie produce a sitcom together. Peter creates the Side Boob Hour, which is exactly the category of content the FCC was attempting to eliminate from the airwaves. The station becomes popular. Then the FCC shuts it down and then, in the episode's key satirical escalation, does not stop there. They begin following ordinary citizens around town and censoring their actual words and behaviors in public life. Air horns replace profanity in conversation. Farts are banned in public spaces. A censor bar appears over Peter's body in his own home. The regulatory impulse, once given permission to exist, does not know where to stop. What makes the episode structurally remarkable is a specific sequence embedded in the middle. The episode cuts to clips from previous Family Guy episodes, but these are not ordinary archive clips. These are scenes that had been cut by Fox's own internal censors before those earlier episodes could air, scenes that had never been broadcast. The show was using the narrative frame of a story about censorship to broadcast the previously censored material, slipping content past the gate by embedding it inside a story about why the gate is absurd. Fox caught it. The broadcast version of PTV had material modified before it ever aired. The scene that drives Lois to contact the FCC was changed between the DVD version and the broadcast version. In the DVD release, Lois is pushed over the edge by Peter appearing on a prank show, in which he relieves himself from a highway overpass onto her car below. Fox's standards department told MacFarlane that if that scene appeared in broadcast, Peter could not be shown pulling down his clothing and the relevant sound effects could not be used. MacFarlane declined to modify the scene on those terms. The broadcast version replaced it entirely with a tamer alternative. The finished, aired episode about the absurdity of broadcast censorship had a scene censored from it. The irony is complete. The FCC song that Peter, Brian, and Stewie perform midway through the episode is one of the sharpest pieces of polemic writing the show produced across its entire run. Set to music that sounds like a Monty Python number, the song calls out the FCC by name, accuses it of constitutional overreach, and argues that the American public has a right to entertainment not filtered through the regulatory anxiety of government bureaucrats responding to organized political pressure. Several of the song's most pointed lines were bleeped for broadcast. The song arguing against censorship of broadcast content contained bleeped language in its broadcast version. The layers of irony accumulate beyond easy summarizing. MacFarlane has spoken about PTV in a way that makes clear the fury driving it was genuine. He described watching the post-Super Bowl regulatory cascade with real disbelief. Watching a half-second of unintended nudity caused changes that affected every scripted show on broadcast television for years. He said Fox's willingness to absorb fines and modify content in response to an organized constituency represented exactly the kind of corporate capitulation to ideological pressure the episode was arguing against. The broader political context matters. Fox sits under the same corporate umbrella as Fox News. MacFarlane is politically liberal and has been consistently and openly so. The FCC crackdown occurred during the Bush administration and was driven substantially by conservative political pressure. The episode was, beneath its animated surface, political commentary aimed directly at the forces MacFarlane saw as working to constrain creative expression in American media, and it aired on a network with significant ideological ties to those same forces. Fox aired it anyway. They modified it, they bleeped parts of it. They replaced one scene with something their standards department found more acceptable, but the central argument made it to broadcast. Whether that constitutes a genuine victory for free expression or demonstrates how a powerful institution accommodates criticism just enough to prevent it from becoming truly threatening is a question worth sitting with. The FCC would continue to be a complication for years. Proposed fines against Fox affiliates for specific Family Guy episodes accumulated to as high as $550,000 across all affiliates. The Parents Television Council named Family Guy the worst TV show of the week on at least 40 separate documented occasions. None of it stopped the show from continuing to push against whatever limits it encountered. If anything, the friction seemed to energize the writing staff. Each time content was cut or flagged, it provided a data point about where the real edges were and a reason to approach those edges from new directions. PTV remains the clearest example of Family Guy using its own platform to critique the platform itself. The show was always arguing for freedom while operating inside a corporate structure that had its own reasons to limit that freedom. PTV is where the show stopped negotiating quietly and just made the argument out loud. And the fact that it worked, that it aired, that it found its audience and generated real conversation, is itself a piece of evidence for the argument the episode was making. Section 4, September 11th. The creator who almost did not survive. There is a particular category of story that people find deeply and persistently unsettling, and it is not horror or tragedy by itself. It is coincidence. The kind of coincidence too precise to feel entirely random, that makes you suddenly aware of how thin the membrane really is between a piece of entertainment and the real world that produced it. Family Guy has one of those stories. On the 11th of September, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was supposed to be on American Airlines Flight 11. That is a documented, confirmed, publicly acknowledged fact that MacFarlane has spoken about in multiple interviews over many years. He had been in Rhode Island speaking at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design. He was scheduled to return to Los Angeles on Flight 1 out of Boston Logan Airport, departing at 7:45 inches the morning. His travel agent made an error and gave him the wrong departure time, telling him the flight left at 8:15 instead of 7:45. MacFarlane had also gone out the evening before and was, by his own account, feeling the effects the next morning. He arrived at the airport approximately 10 minutes after boarding had closed on Flight 11. The gate agent told him he had missed his flight and would have to wait for the next departure. He made his way to the airport lounge and waited. Less than an hour later, the plane he had been scheduled to board struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center, killing all 92 people on board. MacFarlane has described the experience in interviews as one of those moments where the reality of what almost happened arrives gradually, in pieces, as you begin to understand what you are watching on the television screens around you. He called his assistant to say he was safe, but the message was not received for approximately 20 minutes, during which the people who knew his travel schedule believed he might have been among the passengers on Flight 11. Family Guy was in the gap between its cancellations at that moment. The show had ended after its third season, and MacFarlane was a 27-year-old creator whose television future was genuinely unclear. Consider carefully what would have changed if he had made it to the gate on time that morning. If the hangover had been slightly less severe, if the travel agent had given him the correct departure time, there would have been no Adult Swim rerun ratings that convinced Fox to reconsider the show's commercial value. There would have been no DVD sales data that built the case for a revival. There would have been no Season 4, no American Dad, no The Orville, no Ted, no 20 more seasons of Family Guy and counting. The story of Family Guy, in the version of September 11th where MacFarlane boards his flight on time, ends with 3 seasons and a cancellation. The connection between the show and that morning has additional layers most casual viewers have never encountered. In 2000, Family Guy had aired an episode called Road to Rhode Island, featuring Brian and Stewie on one of their travel adventures. In a brief cutaway during that episode, there was a joke involving Osama bin Laden in an airport context, a throwaway cultural reference of the kind the show was making constantly. It aired in early 2000, over a year before September 11th. After the attacks, when the show's DVD sets were being prepared, that sequence was quietly removed from the episode without any announcement. If you have only ever seen the DVD or streaming version of Road to Rhode Island, you have watched an edited version. The original broadcast version exists, preserved in recordings that circulate among the community of people who document the show's broadcast history. In at least 2 early episodes, background shots depicting the New York City skyline include the World Trade Center towers. After September 11th, those background elements were digitally modified in subsequent broadcast and rerun versions. The towers were replaced or simply removed. DVD releases preserve the original versions. Streaming versions vary by platform. Family Guy is unique in having a creator who is personally scheduled to be on one of the planes, which gives every post-September 11th edit in the show's catalog a personal weight that similar edits in other shows do not carry. The show's direct engagement with September 11th escalated significantly over the years. In Season 10, in an episode called Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie use Stewie's time machine to travel back to the events of the show's very first episode in 1999. While in the past, Brian tells his earlier self about the September 11th attacks, providing information that will allow the tragedy to be prevented. The logic seems obvious at first. But as the episode develops, preventing September 11th creates a cascade of unintended consequences, leading to a second American Civil War far more catastrophic than the original timeline. Brian and Stewie eventually realize the only way to prevent the worst outcome is to allow September 11th to happen. In the episode's most deliberately provocative moment, they hold a vote among their various time-traveling duplicate selves. The vote goes in favor of letting the attacks occur, and they exchange a high five. The episode aired in November of 2011, exactly 2 months after the 10th anniversary of the attacks. Critics and viewers divided sharply over it. Some found the high five deeply offensive. Others argued the episode was engaging seriously with a philosophical question about historical causation, that even terrible events exist within causal chains that would be impossible to disrupt without unpredictable and potentially worse consequences, and that dismissing it as offensive missed the actual argument underneath. What MacFarlane thought about making that episode, given his personal history with September 11th, he has kept largely private. What is clear is that a man who missed his own death on September 11th by 10 minutes eventually created an episode in which his characters vote to let September 11th happen. That is either profound self-examination, an act of extraordinary creative courage, or both. Section 5. The Vault episode: What the show could do when it chose to. Before we move to the prediction stories and the stranger coincidences, there is an episode of Family Guy that deserves careful attention, not because it was banned or suppressed, but because it is so dramatically different from everything surrounding it that it seems to exist in a separate category entirely. What it reveals about the show's capabilities is more significant than almost anything else in 25 years of episodes. The episode is called Brian and Stewie. Season 8, Episode 17, the 150th episode of the show's overall run. It aired on the 2nd of May 2010, written by Gary Janetti, who had been with the show since its earliest seasons. The premise is simple. Brian and Stewie get accidentally locked inside a bank vault over a long weekend. They cannot reach anyone for help. Nobody knows they are there. They have to get through until Monday morning when the bank opens, with nothing but each other for company. That is the entire episode. No cutaway to the Griffin household. No Peter subplot. No celebrity cameos. No gags lifted from popular culture. And, most importantly, there are no cutaway gags at all. Not one. The show's signature comedic tool, the format element that had defined its identity since the very first episode in 1999, is completely absent for the entire 30 minutes. It is just a dog and a baby in a locked room, talking. The idea came from producer Cara Vallo and McFarlane's shared admiration for a specific episode of All in the Family, in which Archie Bunker gets locked in his basement and has to spend an evening alone, confronting himself without his normal distractions. The Family Guy version applies that structure to the show's two most intellectually matched characters. What emerges is something the show had never quite attempted before. The episode is, at its core, about the gap between who Brian Griffin wants people to think he is and who he actually is. About the distance between the version of yourself you perform for the world and the version that exists in quieter, unperformed moments. Brian has a gun in his safety deposit box at this bank. When Stewie finds it and asks about it, noting that Brian is a vocal gun control advocate and therefore the last person one would expect to own a firearm, Brian resists answering. Then, when there is no more space to resist in, he does. He keeps the gun because there are days when the gap between who he wanted to be and who he has managed to become feels unbridgeable. He stores it at the bank rather than at home, because putting physical distance between himself and the means of a choice he sometimes thinks about is the only protection he can give himself against those days. The bottle of scotch in the same box is for what would be a last drink. He came to the bank that particular day, he clarifies, because it was also the day his Christmas savings deposit was due. The practical and the existential sharing the same time slot, which is how those things actually coexist in real human life. Stewie, in response, does something the evil genius baby of the first 3 seasons would never have done. He tells Brian that he is his only real friend. That Brian gives his existence meaning and structure in a way that nobody else does. He says it plainly, without the protective layer of irony he usually deploys, the way someone says something true, when there is no longer any reason to perform otherwise. The episode ends with the vault opening on Monday morning, and both characters returning to their ordinary lives, with no acknowledgement from anyone else in the Griffin household that anything significant happened. The next episode is back to normal. The emotional reality of Brian and Stewie does not carry forward permanently. The gun is never mentioned again. The vulnerability is never revisited in the same direct terms. This is one of the defining features of Family Guy's relationship with its characters. The show could do what Brian and Stewie does. It was always capable of reaching for that. The reason it did not do it more often was not inability, it was choice. The writing room chose, consistently and repeatedly across its entire run, to return to the surface rather than staying in the depth that was always available to it. Brian and Stewie is the proof that the surface was always a choice and never a limitation. The episode is also notable for being the only episode in the show's history with no cutaway gags, no musical numbers, and no characters other than the 2 named in the title. The critical consensus over time has placed it firmly among the show's best work. It is cited regularly in discussions about what Family Guy was capable of when it took its characters seriously. The gun in the safety deposit box is the episode's central metaphor. Brian is a character who, across 8 seasons at that point, had been given every external marker of the life he claimed to want, and had nonetheless accumulated a quiet, persistent record of failure to become any of those things in any lasting way. The gun in the box is the gap between the character Brian performed for the world and the character Brian actually was when nobody was looking. The vault forced that gap to become something that had to be acknowledged rather than deflected. After the episode aired, the show moved on. Brian became, if anything, more self-consciously performing his sophistication in the seasons that followed. The vulnerability of the vault conversation never resurfaced in the same direct terms. Some moments of truth are not meant to be built on. They are meant to have been said. And the fact that they were said at all, in a half-hour episode about a dog and a baby locked in a bank vault, is something worth sitting with. Section 6. The Death of Brian Griffin and What It Revealed. In November of 2013, Family Guy killed Brian Griffin. Not in a simulation, not in a dream sequence. In the 6th episode of Season 12, Life of Brian, Brian was hit by a car in the street outside the Griffin house and died. The Griffin family mourned him. Stewie was devastated in a way the show rarely allowed any character to be genuinely devastated. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico from The Sopranos, was introduced as his replacement. The reaction was immediate and more intense than anyone involved with producing the episode had anticipated. The hashtag #BringBackBrian trended on social media within hours of the episode airing. A Change.org petition gathered over 100,000 signatures demanding Brian's return. Fans who had been watching the show for years expressed something that went beyond disappointment about a narrative choice. It was real grief, the kind of emotional response that reveals a depth of attachment to fictional characters that the audience themselves might not have fully acknowledged until that attachment was directly threatened. Seth MacFarlane said publicly he was surprised by the intensity of the reaction. He acknowledged that the storyline accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. It reminded audiences the show was still capable of doing something genuinely unexpected, and it drove attention and ratings back to a show that had been struggling with declining viewership. Executive producer Steve Callahan had framed it to Rolling Stone as a way to shake things up. The show's ratings had decreased roughly 21% in the period leading up to the decision. 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode Christmas Guy, Stewie used a time travel device to go back and push Brian out of the path of the oncoming car. Brian was back. Vinny disappeared from the narrative almost immediately, appearing in a handful of subsequent cutaway gags before being written out of existence. Everything returned to exactly how it had been before Life of Brian aired. MacFarlane's tweet after the resurrection aired completed the picture for many viewers. "Thanks for caring so much about the canine Griffin. He is overcome with gratitude." I mean, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian, did you? Jesus, we'd have to be f***ing high. Some people found this funny. Others experienced it as the show mocking its audience for having felt something real, for forming an emotional connection that the show then used deliberately and then publicly acknowledged as a publicity mechanism. The Life of Brian arc is the most extreme and most explicitly self-acknowledged version of a pattern that had been present in the show's DNA since the revival years. Family Guy had long operated on a logic of emotional investment and withdrawal. Give the audience something to feel, generate real engagement from that feeling, and then remove the thing before any permanent change could take hold. The 2-part Stewie kills Lois storyline in Season 6 ended with a simulation reset that erased everything. The reconciliation scenes between Peter and Meg that appeared periodically reset by the following episode without acknowledgement. Character development moments evaporated between seasons without accumulation. Brian's death and resurrection was the most extreme version of this pattern, but it was not new, it was the pattern. What the intensity of the fan reaction revealed was that audiences had formed genuine bonds with these characters across 15 years of the show's existence. Bonds deep enough that even the threat of permanent loss could generate real emotion. What the show's response revealed was that the writers knew those bonds existed, were willing to use them as a promotional resource, and were not willing to honor them by making any permanent change. The compromise implicit in that arrangement, "We will make you feel things, but we will not let those feelings change anything," is one of the defining features of Family Guy in its later seasons. The deeper irony is that Brian, the character whose death generated 100,000 petition signatures, had by Season 12 become one of the most criticized characters the show had. He had drifted far from the dry, witty, loyal voice of reason who made the early show compelling. And yet when the show killed him, audiences responded as if losing the early Brian. The show traded on the emotional credit built by the earlier version of the character to generate a reaction to the death of the later version. The account was still real, still carrying enormous value. The show just spent it on a stunt. Section 7. The predictions that came true. Let us settle in for this one. Get comfortable wherever you are. This section is the one most people find genuinely unsettling. Not through darkness or sadness, but through something quieter. The feeling of patterns aligning in ways they have no business aligning. When something a cartoon depicted years before actually comes to pass in the real world, and the gap between the fictional version and the real one is narrow enough to make you pause. Family Guy has an unusually well-documented history of appearing to predict future events. Some of these are explainable rationally. The writers were smart, culturally embedded people working in Hollywood, a world where certain information about celebrity behavior, about industry dynamics, about the directions culture was heading, circulated internally before it reached mainstream media. A joke about a famous person's private life in 2005 might reflect industry gossip that everyone in a specific corner of Los Angeles knew, but that had not yet become a public news story. Other instances are harder to dismiss. In May of 2009, Family Guy aired a Season 7 episode called We Love You, Conrad. While the story briefly passes through the world of the TV show The Hills, Stewie makes a remark about Bruce Jenner, the former Olympic gold medalist then best known as a celebrity peripheral to the Kardashian universe. Stewie says, plainly and without particular emphasis, that he does not believe Bruce Jenner is a man. That Jenner is, in fact, a woman, and that the prevailing media presentation of Jenner as male is simply what the press wants the public to think. In the episode's context, this line is not a setup to anything. There is no punchline that follows. It reads as a random non sequitur, the kind the show dropped in constantly with no intention of following up. In April 2015, 6 years after that episode aired, Bruce Jenner announced publicly that she was a transgender woman who would be known going forward as Caitlyn Jenner. Her transition became one of the major cultural conversations of that year. After the announcement, the 2009 clip of Stewie's comment began circulating widely online. People who had seen the episode on original broadcast tried to remember whether the line had seemed significant at the time. It had not. But in retrospect, with the knowledge of what 2015 would bring, it reads like something far more deliberate. The show had returned to the subject in Season 10, in Lottery Fever, in which Peter summons Bruce Jenner to perform a burlesque dance for a group of Navy SEALs. The performance is visibly and deliberately feminine. Peter's comment to the watching crowd adds another layer to the pattern. 4 years before the public transition, the show had referenced the subject twice in ways that would only become legible as prediction in retrospect. The Kevin Spacey reference is different in character and more troubling in what it might imply. In a 2005 Season 4 episode, baby Stewie is depicted running through a shopping mall, terrified, screaming that he has escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. The joke was presented as a random non sequitur. One celebrity name among many the show dropped in unexpected context throughout its run. In October 2017, 12 years after that episode aired, actor Anthony Rapp publicly accused Kevin Spacey of making inappropriate sexual advances toward him in 1986, when Rapp was 14 years old. Multiple additional allegations against Spacey followed. Spacey's career effectively ended within weeks of the initial disclosure. The gap between a joke in a 2005 cartoon and a 2017 news story is 12 years, long enough that the connection would seem obviously coincidental if the joke had been generic. But the joke was specifically about a child in distress invoking Spacey's name in a very particular context. Either the show was reflecting industry gossip that had been circulating quietly for years, or the alignment between the fictional reference and the real event is a coincidence of unusual precision. A statistical argument exists for all of this material. Comedy writers make provocative jokes about public figures constantly. Over long enough time frames, some of those jokes will align with real events through probability alone. Family Guy has been making celebrity jokes for over 25 years, which is an extremely large sample size for producing coincidences. That argument is entirely sound. It does not fully eliminate the unsettling quality of some of these specific cases, but it provides a rational framework that does not require anything supernatural. There are other prediction-adjacent moments scattered throughout the show's run. Various episodes depicted technology, social behaviors, and cultural phenomena before they became mainstream realities. Some read as genuine foresight. Others are simply examples of a show paying close attention to where things were heading. These moments accumulate over time without any single satisfying explanation. They sit most comfortably in the quiet hours, when the mind is soft enough to hold the mystery without needing to resolve it immediately. Section 8. The Robin Williams Broadcast. Among all the strange resonances between Family Guy and real-world events, there is one that people who experienced it in real time still struggle to describe without feeling slightly unmoored. It does not belong in the prediction category, because it was not a matter of the show depicting something that later happened. It belongs in its own category entirely, the category of timing so precise that the word coincidence feels inadequate, even when coincidence is almost certainly the accurate explanation. The 11th of August 2014. BBC Three in the United Kingdom was airing a scheduled repeat broadcast of a Family Guy episode called Family Guy Viewer Mail Number 2. This was a Season 10 anthology episode originally aired in the United States in May 2012, structured around 3 segments responding to fictional viewer mail. The second segment, called Fat Man and Robin, features Peter Griffin being given the power to transform anyone he touches into a version of Robin Williams. Peter becomes overwhelmed as everyone around him, his family, his friends, strangers on the street, becomes a Robin Williams character. Desperate to stop the transformation from spreading further, Peter attempts multiple times within the episode's cartoon logic to find an escape from his predicament. The episode aired on BBC Three at 11:25 inches the evening, London time, on the 11th of August 2014. At approximately 11:50 that same evening, news began to break across television networks and online platforms that Robin Williams had died earlier that day at his home in Tiburon, California. He was 63 years old. The timing was such that the episode ended and the news broke almost simultaneously. Viewers who had been watching the segment switched to their phones or other channels and saw the reports. The episode about a world overflowing with Robin Williams ended just as the world learned that Robin Williams was gone from it. The BBC issued a statement saying the episode had been scheduled weeks in advance as a routine repeat broadcast, that the scheduling decision had nothing to do with foreknowledge of what would happen on August 11th, and that the coincidence was entirely unintentional. That explanation is almost certainly true. No one at BBC Three could have known what would happen on that specific date when they scheduled a repeat episode weeks earlier. And yet the timing was what it was. The people who were watching that night in Britain, who saw the episode end and then saw the news begin, described the experience in ways that go beyond ordinary surprise. There is a quality to that kind of coincidence that is different from ordinary unexpected events. It touches something in the relationship between fiction and reality that most of us keep carefully separated. When they overlap with that kind of precision, the separation becomes visible in a way it usually is not, and the visibility is unsettling in ways that resist easy explanation. In the years following, various networks and streaming platforms handled the episode with varying sensitivity. Some aired it with content notices, some temporarily removed it from rotation schedules. It was never formally banned the way partial terms of endearment has been, but it occupies an uncomfortable position in the show's archive. A piece of entertainment that, because of what happened on a specific night in August, carries weight it was never designed to carry. Timing is everything in comedy. MacFarlane built an entire show on that principle. The world occasionally provides its own timing without asking permission. Section 9. Quagmire and the darkness underneath the joke. Most characters in long-running animated comedies age like paper. The years pile up around them, but the character stays fixed, performing the same function with the same traits season after season. Glenn Quagmire is different, not because he grows or changes in meaningful ways, but because if you step back and look at the complete picture of everything the show has depicted him doing across 25-plus seasons, what emerges is genuinely disturbing in ways the show has never fully acknowledged. And what emerges from the fan theory community around him is more disturbing still. On the surface, Quagmire is the sex-obsessed neighbor. He is Peter Griffin's friend. He lives next door, and almost everything funny about him derives from his complete orientation towards sexual conquest. He has the signature catchphrases, the swagger, the apparently inexhaustible optimism of someone who has never meaningfully encountered consequences. But if you pay careful attention to the full catalog of what the show has depicted him actually doing across its run, the character becomes something considerably darker than a broad comic archetype. The show has depicted Quagmire entering the Griffin home without permission on multiple occasions. He has engaged with an underage teenager in contexts the show plays entirely as jokes. The show has depicted stalking behavior directed toward Lois across multiple episodes. It has depicted him drugging women. It has used human trafficking as background detail in a gag. Every one of these things is presented through the frame of animation and absurdism in a way that provides cover the same material in a live-action drama would never receive. The fan theory most persistently associated with Quagmire proposes that he does not age normally because he is not, in any conventional sense, a normal human being. The show has given him stated ages ranging from mid-40s to early 60s at various points, but his physical appearance across all 25-plus seasons is essentially unchanged. What makes the theory interesting is that the lack of aging, combined with the complete catalog of documented behavior and certain specific background details assembled from various episodes, suggests a character who has been doing what he does for much longer than any ordinary human lifespan would accommodate. The most elaborate version of the theory suggests that Quagmire's apparent immunity to consequences is not simply a result of the show's general disregard for realistic consequence, but rather a quality specific to whatever Quagmire actually is at a fundamental level. His apparent agelessness, his perpetual luck, his ability to avoid the accumulation of damage his behavior would logically cause, all of these fit a pattern of something performing humanity rather than inhabiting it. This is obviously a reading the show was never designed to support. It is fan imagination filling in the outline of a character drawn broadly enough to support almost any interpretation. But the fact that 25 years of accumulated behavior, taken seriously rather than dismissed as comedy shorthand, produces a portrait that makes the theory feel almost plausible, says something about how the show has used this character over the years. His birth name adds another dimension. In a later season episode, it is revealed that Quagmire's birth name is Glenn Quagglechek. He changed it. A person who changes their name has done something deliberate about their identity. Whatever Quagglechek carried, whatever history, whatever version of himself, Quagmire left behind when he chose his current name. The show never explores what that original self looked like. The theory space that lives in that gap is almost certainly more interesting than anything the writers would have put there. The speech Quagmire delivers in Season 8, in the episode Jerome is the New Black, remains the most analyzed Quagmire moment in the show's history. He turns to Brian and, without prompting, delivers a comprehensive point-by-point accounting of why he finds Brian insufferable. He calls Brian a phony. He catalogs Brian's failed writing career. He names Brian's treatment of women, his abandonment of his own biological child, his relentless intellectual posturing. Every single claim is supported by things the show has actually depicted on screen. None of it is exaggeration. It is a summary of documented behavior, delivered with the precision of someone who has been paying close attention for years. The irony at the center of this speech is striking. Quagmire, whose own documented behavior represents far more serious violations than anything Brian has done, is the one delivering the moral judgment. The show puts an accurate speech about integrity and honesty in the mouth of a character who has none of either. Whether that is intentional commentary on the observation that the worst people are often the most perceptive critics of others, or whether the writers simply did not think carefully about who they chose to put these words in the mouth of, is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that after the speech aired and became one of the show's most discussed moments, nothing changed. Quagmire did not become more self-aware about his own behavior. Brian did not meaningfully improve. The speech documented a real problem accurately and had zero lasting impact on either character's trajectory, which is, in its own way, the most Quagmire thing imaginable. Section 10. Meg Griffin and the Theory That Changes Everything. Here is a thought experiment. Imagine a character in a television show who is consistently surrounded by chaos, cruelty, and dysfunction, but who responds to all of it with resilience, self-awareness, and a persistent desire for things to be better. Imagine that this character is the one in her family who holds down jobs, maintains actual friendships, pursues genuine interests, and expresses empathy toward people who do not particularly deserve it. Imagine she is the only character who ever calls out the dysfunction around her accurately, articulately, and with specific evidence. Now imagine that the show treats this character as the least important, most ridiculous, most disposable member of the cast for roughly 10 consecutive seasons. That character is Meg Griffin. And the theory about her is this: Meg is the sanest person in the Griffin household, possibly the sanest character on the entire show. This theory has genuine textual support within the show itself. In Season 1, Meg is an ordinary teenager, unpopular at school, a bit boring compared to the rest of her unusual family, looking for attention and validation in the same unremarkable ways that most teenagers do. The jokes about her in those early seasons are mild. She is the least interesting person in an extremely interesting family, which makes her seem dull by contrast, but she is not actively mistreated. There are moments in those early seasons where Peter clearly cares about his oldest daughter, even if he expresses it imperfectly. What happened between seasons 1 and 4, and what accelerated dramatically between seasons 4 and 14, was the progressive escalation of the family's treatment of Meg from mild neglect into something that the show itself, in the Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, acknowledges openly constitutes sustained abuse. In that episode, the Griffin family is trapped together at home during a hurricane, with no way to escape. Meg, after years of accumulated mistreatment and with nowhere to go, finally confronts her family directly. She addresses Peter and catalogs his behavior with the precision of someone who has been keeping an internal record for a long time. She calls him selfish, irresponsible, and dangerous to the people around him. She names specific things he has done to her. She tells him what years of his behavior have cost her. She is not hysterical. She is not performing. She is giving a coherent speech based on documented evidence, and every piece of evidence she cites is real and verifiable within the show's own history. The family falls apart in response. Without Meg absorbing all the anger and resentment and frustration that normally circulates in the Griffin household, that energy has nowhere to go. Peter and Lois and Chris and Brian begin directing it at each other. The family system collapses because one specific component, the component being used as a drain and a release valve, has temporarily stopped performing that function. The episode ends with Meg choosing to go back to that role. She talks to Brian, who explains that her function in the family is essentially structural. She is the element that makes everyone else's dysfunction manageable by absorbing it, and without her performing that function, the family cannot hold together. Meg accepts this. She goes back to being the target. The theory reading of this ending is that Meg Griffin is the only character who has ever clearly seen the family's dysfunction, named it accurately and specifically, and then chosen to stay anyway. Not because she lacks the understanding or ability to leave, not because she does not understand what is being done to her, but because on some level she has decided that keeping the family together matters more than her own comfort and well-being. Whether that represents love or psychological damage, or both simultaneously, is a question the show declines to answer. Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg since the second season, has spoken publicly about finding some of the later seasons' treatment of the character genuinely difficult to perform professionally. The discomfort she expressed was not about technical challenge. It was about what those scenes ask the character to be. Kunis has said in interviews that Meg deserves better. That assessment from the actress who has spent decades giving Meg her voice carries considerable weight. The show did eventually pull back substantially on the most extreme treatment of Meg. By season 15 and beyond, the systematic family-wide cruelty decreased significantly. She received storylines where she was competent, resilient, and occasionally triumphant. The addition of more women to the writing staff in the show's later years is credited by some observers as contributing to this shift. The theory about Meg as the show's moral center, the character whose resilience and capacity for love in the face of sustained mistreatment marks her as fundamentally saner than the people around her, does not depend on the later seasons. It is built from the evidence of who she is even through the worst of what the show put her through. The Meg who stands up in Seahorse Seashell Party and gives an accurate speech about her family's behavior and then chooses to stay with them anyway is the most genuinely complex and interesting character the show ever produced. She is just the one the show spent the least time acknowledging as such. Section 11. Stewie Griffin and the Ghost Theory. Every great television show has that one character who makes it genuinely stand out from everything else. The character that people remember even if they have never watched a single full episode. The character that gets quoted and imitated and turned into cultural shorthand. For the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, that character was Stewie Griffin, and his story within the show is one of the strangest and most interesting character arcs in the history of animation, not because of what happened to him, but because of what was deliberately taken away from him, one season at a time. Stewie in Season 1 was introduced as an evil genius, not a peripheral trait or a recurring gag. It was his entire identity, his complete reason for existing as a character. Almost every scene with Stewie in that first season involved him either constructing something dangerous in his bedroom, scheming about world domination in elaborate detail, or working on a new plan to harm his mother Lois. He built ray guns. He built mind control devices. He spoke with a refined British accent, like a Bond villain compressed into the body of a 12-month-old, delivering elaborate monologues about plans for global domination while Lois fed him strained peas. The comedy came entirely from the contrast between what he looked like and what he was saying. A baby in a yellow shirt and a diaper, physically dependent on the adults around him for every basic need, calmly plotting the subjugation of all of humanity. The gap between those two realities was the engine that generated the humor, and it never got old in those early seasons because the writers kept finding new angles on it. Starting around Season 3 and accelerating dramatically with the show's revival in Season 4, the writers began deliberately moving Stewie away from this defining identity. They acknowledged publicly in interviews that they felt the evil genius baby concept had been taken as far as it could go, that they had explored every interesting angle of the world domination plots, and that continuing to return to those same wells would make the character feel stale and repetitive. The new direction was toward emotional complexity, personal vulnerability, and a deepening friendship with Brian. The Season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie reads in retrospect as the official farewell to the original version of the character. Stewie achieves everything he ever wanted. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He becomes the global dictator he spent his early existence planning to become. The episodes are dramatic and funny and genuinely exciting. And then the twist arrives. It was all a simulation running on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened. Everything resets. After those episodes, the evil genius Stewie largely retired from the show. What remained was a Stewie who was funny and emotionally alive, but who was no longer the unique, original, genuinely dangerous figure he had been. He had become one of hundreds of animated characters who are quirky and vulnerable and searching for connection. He had stopped being the only character on television who was a scheming baby genius. The fan theory most often associated with Stewie's impossible existence takes a completely different approach to explaining who and what he is. The theory begins from the show's most persistently unusual structural feature. Most adults in the show cannot hear Stewie as the articulate being he actually is. They perceive him as a baby making baby sounds, not as someone capable of extended, sophisticated conversation. Brian is the exception. Brian hears everything Stewie says and responds to it in full. The show has acknowledged this as an intentional creative flexibility, but the theory treats it as a significant clue about the nature of Stewie's existence. The theory proposes that Stewie is a ghost, that he died at birth, or very shortly after, and that what the audience sees is the presence of a child who never fully crossed into the living world. Brian, in this reading, can hear and understand Stewie because dogs are perceived in certain folk traditions as being naturally sensitive to presences that human senses cannot perceive. The theory accounts for Stewie's extraordinary omniscience, his knowledge of history, literature, science, military strategy, engineering, and virtually every other domain of human knowledge. By suggesting that a ghost who has existed quietly in a household for a very long time, with nothing to occupy him except observation, would have had unlimited time to absorb everything around him. Books read aloud, conversations overheard across years, television filling the rooms. A presence with infinite time and no body to get tired or distracted would eventually accumulate a comprehensive education. It also accounts for why Stewie's defining obsession in the early seasons was causing harm to Lois. A ghost who died in connection with childbirth, who exists in relationship to the mother and the home without ever having had a living relationship with her, might carry something that resembles grief or unresolved longing toward that mother in a form that a baby's undeveloped psychology can only express as hostility. The evil genius was never actually evil in this reading. It was something more like profound, unresolved anguish, given a vocabulary the show's comedy could accommodate. The show has been running long enough that Stewie is, in the strict accounting of broadcast dates, approaching 27 years old while remaining 1 year old in every episode. He has traveled through time, been placed in cryogenic stasis, and accumulated experiences that would span centuries if counted. The ghost theory does not resolve all of the narrative contradictions of Stewie's existence, but it gives the impossibility a coherence that makes it feel purposeful rather than arbitrary. Section 12. The darkest theory, everything happens in Peter's head. This is the one that changes how you watch everything. Not just individual episodes or particular character choices, but the complete architecture of everything Family Guy has ever depicted. The theory has been developed and refined over years by fan communities online, and it is constructed carefully enough from evidence actually present within the show that it demands to be taken seriously on its own terms. The theory begins with a single premise. Peter Griffin is not in the house on Spooner Street. He is in a psychiatric facility. He has been there for an indeterminate number of years. The events depicted in Family Guy across all of its seasons are not a real family living their real lives. They are the elaborate, internally consistent hallucination of a man in profound psychological crisis, trying to process a tragedy he cannot consciously face. The real-world event the theory proposes as the trigger is this. Peter's children, Meg and Chris, were involved in a serious car accident. Meg was driving. She had been drinking. The accident killed Chris and caused Lois to suffer a miscarriage. She was pregnant with Stewie at the time, who died with the pregnancy. Lois, devastated by the sudden loss of 2 of her children in a single traumatic event, took her own life not long after. Peter, who survived the accident, could not process the magnitude of the loss and retreated entirely into a fantasy. The fantasy is what the audience watches every week. Every structural feature of the show that seems arbitrary or inconsistent in a realistic reading becomes explicable within the theory's framework. Peter's intelligence fluctuates wildly from episode to episode because his self-image within the fantasy is unstable, shifting with his emotional state in the facility. The characters forget events from previous episodes because the man generating the fantasy cannot hold a consistent internal narrative indefinitely. Grief and guilt keep reasserting themselves and reshuffling the details. Consequences do not carry forward between episodes because a mind in this particular kind of crisis cannot maintain continuity across the gaps. Peter's friends Cleveland and Quagmire appear in the fantasy because they actually visit him in the hospital during those visits. Their real-world personalities, the warm and steady Cleveland and the gregarious Quagmire, have been imported into the fantasy as the best friends Peter always wished he had. Joe Swanson, the neighbor who is consistently described as heroic and admirable, is someone Peter has heard about from his visiting friends but has never actually met. This is why Joe is idealized in the fantasy rather than simply observed. Peter cannot fill in the real details of someone he has never known. Meg in the fantasy is the designated target of accumulated parental rage that Peter cannot express consciously. She was the one driving when the accident happened. In the real world, Peter cannot let himself be consciously angry at his daughter for an accident that was not entirely her fault. In the fantasy, that anger has to go somewhere, and it goes into making the Meg of the imaginary household the family's designated absorber of cruelty and contempt. The moments when Peter shows compassion toward Meg in the fantasy, the occasional episodes where he tries to be a better father, the brief reconciliations that never hold, are echoes of the real emotion he carries toward his real daughter, surfacing through the protective layer of the fantasy before being suppressed again. Stewie is the most heartbreaking element of the theory. Peter never knew Stewie. The baby died before being born. In the fantasy, Peter has invented a child who never got to exist. He imagines Stewie as everything a father might project onto an unborn child. Extraordinary intelligence, spectacular potential, a personality too vivid and too alive to be contained by ordinary life. Stewie's obsession in the early seasons is Peter's unconscious expressing grief and anger in the only vocabulary the fantasy can accommodate. Stewie's gradual softening across later seasons reflects Peter's own gradual emotional processing of what happened. Brian, the talking dog, the intellectual, the voice of reason, is Peter's own intelligence displaced outside of himself. Peter, in the real world, believes he failed. He failed as a husband, as a father, as a man capable of protecting the people he loved. He cannot accept that he is intelligent because intelligent people do not fail the way he failed. So his intelligence has been given to the dog, who can embody intellect without being required to have saved anyone with it. The theory explains why only Brian can hear and understand Stewie. Brian is the honest part of Peter's mind, the part that knows the truth about what is real within the fantasy and what is not. Stewie is not real. He is an imagined child, a child who never got to exist. And the honest part of Peter's mind can see him clearly, while the rest of the fantasy maintains the pretense that he is a living, ordinary baby. The reset button the show keeps pressing, the way consequences dissolve between episodes, the way character development never accumulates into permanent change, is not a failure of writing. It is the mechanics of a broken mind trying to hold a fantasy together across time. The man in the facility cannot sustain change within the fantasy because change would require acknowledging what happened in the real world. The fantasy must stay the fantasy, or it falls apart entirely. This is a theory, not a statement of fact. It is almost certainly not what Seth MacFarlane intended when he pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in 1998. But it is constructed carefully enough from evidence actually present within the show that it has the quality of all the best fan theories. It makes the work feel richer, more purposeful, more emotionally honest than the surface suggests. The thing that makes it linger long after you have heard it is the image it produces, not the cartoon family in their bright house in their cartoon Rhode Island neighborhood. The real man in the real facility, surrounded by the real absence of the people he loved, building their living replacements in the only place he still has access to them. The inside of his own head lit up with color and noise and the sound of their voices, going on forever. Section 13. Seth MacFarlane steps back. There is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of creative works that become enormously successful. A person builds something singular, something that bears the unmistakable marks of a specific sensibility and a specific vision. They pour enormous energy into the early work. The work becomes a hit, becomes a brand, becomes bigger than any single person can fully manage. Other opportunities arrive. The creator begins spending their energy elsewhere. And gradually the work changes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the aggregate manner of something that was once guided by a particular intelligence and is now guided by the institutional momentum of its own success. This is exactly what happened with Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy. In the early years of the show's existence, MacFarlane was not just the creator and the voice of 4 main characters. He was deeply involved in the writing process, the animation decisions, the overall creative direction of every episode. He had opinions about individual jokes. He had a clear sense of what the show was supposed to feel like and what it was not supposed to become. The original writing staff he assembled included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker, people whose sensibilities were compatible with his, who understood what the show was trying to do. When the show was canceled the first time, that team dispersed. When the show came back, some returned and some did not. New writers came in, the voices in the room changed. Around 2011, MacFarlane reduced his day-to-day creative involvement significantly. The show-running responsibilities transferred primarily to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin. MacFarlane continued to record his character voices, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, but the decisions about what those characters would say and do were increasingly being made by people other than him. He had other things he was building. The 2012 film Ted earned over $500 million worldwide and established him as a viable film director beyond television. A Million Ways to Die in the West followed in 2014. The Orville premiered on Fox in 2017 before moving to Hulu. He also maintained a recording career releasing big band and jazz standards albums. He was one of the busiest people in Hollywood, and Family Guy was one item on a very long list. His relationship with Fox became openly strained. In 2020, he signed a reported $200 million deal with NBC Universal that moved his production company away from Fox's ecosystem entirely. In 2021, he posted on social media expressing that Fox News commentary made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He described his ongoing relationship with Fox as similar to a failing marriage, both parties knowing it was not working but neither having an easy way out. That is an extraordinary public statement from a creator about the network that has aired his most successful show for 25 years. And yet the show continued. In April 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 additional seasons in a major deal with Disney, Fox's parent company, extending the show through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. 15 episodes per season? At minimum, 60 more episodes. MacFarlane's stated reason for not opposing this continuation: the show makes enough money to fund environmental conservation causes he cares about. He said in a 2024 interview that the show had reached what he called escape velocity, that it had been running for so long there was no longer any logical reason to stop it. And as long as audiences kept watching, the case for continuation was clear. He framed it in terms of utility rather than passion. He did not mention exciting new stories he wanted to tell. He did not mention creative directions he was eager to explore. The show, in his telling, was a reliable and useful machine rather than a living creative project. That framing tells you most of what you need to know about the gap between what Family Guy was in 1999 and what it has become. The character decisions that fans point to as the clearest examples of the show's decline: Peter's transformation from lovable fool to cruel monster, Brian's drift into insufferability, Stewie's loss of his defining edge, Meg's sustained mistreatment, all of these intensified after 2011 inches, ways that correlate with MacFarlane's decreased presence in the decision-making process. The showrunners who replaced him were competent professionals who knew the show's world thoroughly. But there is a difference between knowing a show and having the vision that created it. During the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike, an earlier version of this tension became visible. MacFarlane was a vocal and active supporter of the writers and joined picket lines. Fox made the decision to air 3 already completed Family Guy episodes against MacFarlane's wishes during the strike, having the contractual right to do so but choosing to exercise it against the explicit preference of the show's creator. MacFarlane experienced this as a betrayal. The relationship between the show's creator and the network that owned it became, after that incident, noticeably more guarded. MacFarlane was also a supporter of writers during the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike, making clear that he would not work on his shows while the strike was ongoing, and participating in the same spirit of solidarity he had shown 15 years earlier. The strike disrupted Family Guy's production schedule once again, adding another break in creative continuity to the show's long and interrupted history. The show did not have a bad captain after MacFarlane stepped back. It just did not have its original captain. And you could feel the difference accumulating season by season, in the characters that became crueler without purpose, in the cutaway gags that stretched past their natural endpoints, in the stories that reset without consequence, in the warmth that slowly drained away from a household that had once, somehow, felt like a real family despite everything. The numbers. There is a number that tells the Family Guy story more efficiently than any theory or conspiracy or forbidden episode. That number is 22 million. That was the viewership for the very first episode of Family Guy. On the 31st of January 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. 22 million people sat down and watched a new animated show about a family in Rhode Island. Now consider another number, 723,000. That was the average viewership for season 23 of Family Guy. Less than 750,000 people watching new episodes of a show that had once pulled 22 million. The show had lost over 96% of its audience over roughly 24 years of continuous production. Most shows that lose 96% of their audience get canceled at some point along the way. Family Guy did not. It continued producing new episodes as its audience shrank from 22 million to 7 million to 5 million to 3 million to 1 million to less than a million, and it will continue producing new episodes through at least the 2028 to 2029 season. After the Super Bowl premiere, The show averaged 12.8 million households in its first full season, a legitimate and impressive number that placed it 33rd in the Nielsen ratings that year. The scheduling problems of seasons 2 and 3, Fox moving the show to Thursday against Frasier and then Tuesday against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, drove the ratings down enough that the show was canceled after season 3 in 2002. That first cancellation had nothing to do with quality and everything to do with Fox's scheduling decisions, undermining the show's ability to find its audience. The revival in 2005 drew approximately 7.9 million viewers for season 4. Genuinely impressive for a show that had been dead for 3 years, driven by the enormous goodwill built up through Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales. From that high point, the decline was gradual enough to explain away at each individual moment. Tougher competition, audience fragmentation across more platforms, declining live television viewing industry-wide, but stark enough to be unmistakable when viewed across the full span of years. By season 13, which aired from 2014 to 2015, average viewership had fallen to 5.86 million. By season 20, it was 1.31 million. By season 23, 723,000. The network's treatment of the show tracked that decline. For years, Family Guy was one of the anchors of Fox's Sunday night animation domination block, the premium real estate for animated comedy, airing alongside The Simpsons. In 2019, the show was moved from its longtime 9 p.m. Sunday slot to 9:30. For the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Fox moved Family Guy from Sunday nights entirely and placed it on Wednesday nights, the first time the show had aired on a weekday in its regular broadcast schedule since its original troubled run in 2002. Moving from Sunday prime time to Wednesday is understood in the television industry as a demotion. It signals that the network no longer considers the show a tentpole attraction. It means lower expectations, a smaller potential audience, and reduced prominence in the network's overall strategy. In 2009, the show became the first animated series since The Flintstones in 1961 to receive a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series, a nearly 50-year gap in which not even The Simpsons had received that specific recognition. In 2013, TV Guide ranked Family Guy 9th on its list of the greatest television cartoons of all time. These achievements exist. They are part of the permanent record. But they belong to a version of the show that the current production machine has moved steadily further from. The economic rationale for the show's continued existence despite the ratings collapse is straightforward. Animated shows cost significantly less to produce than live-action drama or comedy. The voice cast records in studio booths, animation production happens largely overseas. The budget for a Family Guy season is a fraction of what a comparable live-action comedy costs. At its current viewership level, the show still generates more revenue than it costs to produce when you account for rerun fees, streaming licensing, and merchandise revenue from a 25-year archive. New episodes function partly as marketing material for the existing library, reminders that the show is still alive and still relevant enough to attract some attention, which keeps library value high and licensing deals active. Family Guy has become a show that continues to exist not because it is great but because it is profitable. The audience that once loved it has largely moved on. The ratings prove that beyond any doubt. But the business machine keeps turning because the economics still work. The show is no longer driven by passion or creativity. It is driven by spreadsheets and licensing deals and the fact that it costs very little to keep producing. That is perhaps the quietest and most honest version of the conspiracy hiding inside 25 years of animated comedy. Not a secret meeting, not a deliberate plan to hollow out the show's creative soul. Just the normal, grinding operation of institutional incentives that reward continuation over quality. Because continuation generates predictable returns and quality is unpredictable. It is a more mundane conspiracy than any of the theories we have discussed tonight. But it is also, in some ways, the most genuinely unsettling one. Section 15. What stays? The early morning hours have a way of clarifying things that the daylight keeps complicated. After sitting with a subject long enough, the individual details connect into something larger, and the shape of that larger thing becomes visible. Here is what Family Guy is, taken whole and held up to the light. It is a show that was created by a genuinely talented and transgressive young comedian who had absorbed the best of animated comedy that preceded him and had real things to say, about the American family, about corporate media, about the gap between what we present ourselves as and what we actually are, about the institutions that control what we are allowed to see and what they are actually afraid of. In its early seasons, it said those things with precision and wit and a particular sharp-edged warmth that made it one of the most watched shows in the country. It was not an accident. It was the product of a specific intelligence working at full capacity on a specific set of creative problems, surrounded by a writing room that shared enough of that intelligence to execute the vision consistently. The forbidden episodes are the show at its most genuinely interesting, not necessarily its best episodes by any artistic standard, but the episodes where the show ran directly and visibly into the wall of what broadcasting institutions were willing to allow, and the friction of that collision tells us something true about how those institutions work and what they are actually protecting. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein tells us that networks fear offense, even when there is nothing to be offended by. Partial Terms of Endearment tells us that certain subjects are so politically charged that even a network willing to air almost anything else will not touch them. The PTV episode tells us that creative people who fight censorship are sometimes fighting a system that will censor the fight itself. The Conspiracies and Theories are the audience working on a piece of entertainment that has been running long enough to accumulate mythology. The best of them, the Peter in the psychiatric facility theory, the reading of Meg as the show's moral center, the questions about Stewie's impossible existence and what it means that only Brian can hear him, are not really about Family Guy specifically. They are about what any long-running piece of popular culture eventually generates in the imagination of the people who love it. The question of, what is this really about, beneath the surface? The real-world coincidences are the show at its most uncanny. Seth MacFarlane missing his flight on September 11th by 10 minutes. The Caitlyn Jenner line 6 years before it became meaningful. The Kevin Spacey gag 12 years before the news arrived. The Robin Williams episode airing on the night Robin Williams died. These moments sit in a category that logic can describe but not fully contain. The membrane between the cartoon world and the real one, thinner than anyone assumed, made visible by the wrong kind of timing. The ratings collapse and the production machinery are the show at its most honest. This is what happens to creative work when it becomes commercial infrastructure. The work continues, the brand persists, the characters stay on the screen. But the energy that made the work matter, the particular urgency of a young creator with something to say, working in a moment when that vision felt genuinely new, that energy does not survive indefinitely. It gets spent. It gets replaced by habit and formula, and the institutional memory of what worked before. And yet, here is the thing that refuses to let the narrative be purely one of decline. The early seasons are still there. They have not been erased. The wit and the warmth and the original genius of Peter and Brian and Stewie and Lois and Meg as they were originally conceived, all of it still exists in the archive, available to anyone who looks for it. The later seasons do not retroactively diminish what was achieved in the early ones. The show that exists today and the show that premiered on the 31st of January 1999 are different shows wearing the same name, and knowing that is what allows you to appreciate both on their own terms without having to pretend either is something it is not. The forbidden episodes will remain forbidden for as long as the institutional politics that buried them remain in place. The theories will continue to develop, accumulating new details and new layers with each passing season. The predictions will continue to surface and be discussed in comment sections at all hours of the night. MacFarlane will continue to voice his four characters, long after his investment in the decisions those characters make has largely been delegated elsewhere. The show that was going to change things, the one that 22 million people found after the Super Bowl and connected with, is still in there somewhere. Buried under seasons and seasons of accumulated content, locked in the vault of those early episodes, waiting for anyone who wants to go looking for it. That is what all the late-night attention is really about, when you come down to it. Not the controversy or the conspiracies, not the predictions or the forbidden content, not the ratings charts or the corporate renewal deals. It is the search for the version of something that you connected with, when it was still new and still felt like it had been made just for you. That version exists. It has always existed. And if you know where to look, it always will. If this found you in the dark tonight and kept you company for a while, a like and a subscribe mean more than you might think. And leave a comment when you wake up. Or right now if you are still awake and tell me where in the world you are watching from. I will be reading them. I will see you in the next one. Section 16. The Lost Cuts and the episodes that almost were. One of the things that makes the Forbidden Episode story so interesting is that the two officially banned or restricted episodes represent only the visible tip of something much larger. Beneath the surface of the show's official history lies an entire archaeology of content that was written, sometimes animated, sometimes recorded, and then quietly removed, modified, shelved, or simply never made it past the development stage. The Forbidden Episodes are the dramatic cases, the ones that got noticed. But the story of what Family Guy could not say, or chose not to say, runs much deeper than those two high-profile examples. The PTV episode is perhaps the clearest window into this buried catalog because the episode itself literally used the existence of that buried material as part of its argument. When the episode cuts to clips from previous Family Guy episodes that had been cut by Fox's internal censors before those earlier episodes could air, it is showing the audience something real. Those were genuine cuts. Those were scenes that the writers had written, that had made it through production, and that Fox's Standards and Practices Department had decided could not be broadcast. The audience watching PTV in 2005 was seeing, for the first time, material from episodes they had already watched that had originally contained more content than they knew. This is a practice that animated shows on broadcast networks engage in routinely and somewhat quietly. The DVD releases of Family Guy have consistently contained content that was modified or removed for broadcast, and for fans of the show who bought the DVD sets in the early years of the show's run, comparing the broadcast version to the home video version became its own small hobby. The differences were sometimes minor, a word changed here, a sound effect restored there. Other times they were more significant, entire scenes restored, or entirely different versions of sequences included. The practice of maintaining two versions of content, a broadcast version that clears the standards and practices process, and an uncut version that reflects the original creative intent, became so normalized around Family Guy that fans began treating the DVD versions as the canonical texts of the show, the thing the creators actually intended, and the broadcast versions as compromised approximations of that intent. This is an unusual relationship for a television audience to have with a show's official broadcast. Most television viewers accept what airs on television as the definitive version of a show. For Family Guy fans, there was an ongoing awareness that what aired on Fox was often not the whole story. The gap between the broadcast version and the DVD version became so well established that it started to function as a form of commentary on the show itself. Each time a piece of content appeared on the DVD that had been cut from broadcast, it was a small data point in the larger argument about what the network would and would not allow, and about where the show's own creative instincts pointed when they were not being constrained by the broadcast standards process. In aggregate, those small data points added up to a picture of a show that was consistently pushing against limits and consistently having those pushes partially absorbed by the system it was working within. The question of what else might exist in Fox's archive, what material was written and produced and then either cut from episodes before they were finished or simply rejected at the script stage, is genuinely interesting and genuinely unknowable from the outside. What we know is that the show's writers were consistently ambitious about the content they were trying to put into broadcast television, and that the broadcast standards and practices process was consistently pushing back against that ambition. The two banned episodes we have discussed at length were the cases where the push and the pushback reached a visible and publicly documented conclusion. But they almost certainly do not represent the full extent of what the show tried to say and was prevented from saying. The Osama bin Laden airport gag from the year 2000, removed from the DVD of Road to Rhode Island, is one example of content that existed, was broadcast, and was then retrospectively removed from the official record for reasons that had nothing to do with Fox's Standards and Practices process and everything to do with the changed context that September 11th created. The Twin Towers removed from background skylines is another example of the same phenomenon. The world changed, and the show's historical record was quietly edited to reflect that change. These were not censorship decisions in the traditional sense. They were the maintenance of a catalog in a world that had become different from the world in which the original content was produced. What is interesting about all of these various forms of content management, the banned episodes, the DVD cuts, the post-September 11th edits, the material cut during the standards and practices process, is that they collectively demonstrate the degree to which what reaches the audience is always already a mediated version of what was made. Family Guy is a show that spent years making arguments about censorship and free expression, while simultaneously existing within a system that was constantly making decisions about what of its content would and would not be allowed to reach its audience. The show was always simultaneously the argument and the example of what the argument was about. This is not unique to Family Guy, of course. Every broadcast television show exists within this same system of mediation. Every show's content passes through standards and practices. Every show has material that gets modified or cut. But Family Guy is unusual in having made that process so explicitly visible, in having turned the existence of the cuts into content itself, in having used the experience of fighting with the censorship system as fuel for some of its most pointed and creative episodes. The show understood its own position within the broadcast system in a way that most shows do not, or at least in a way that most shows choose not to acknowledge quite so directly. Section 17. The International Incidents and What They Reveal. One of the underreported dimensions of Family Guy's history of controversy is how far beyond the United States that controversy has extended. The show has been the subject of significant complaints, protests, boycotts, and regulatory actions in countries around the world, in contexts that illuminate the specific cultural sensitivities of those places and also reveal something about what the show was actually doing when it was at its most provocative. The Venezuelan situation is perhaps the most dramatic example. In 2009, a Family Guy episode called 420 featured Brian Griffin leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the town. The episode makes a fairly clear argument for drug policy reform, presented through the show's usual comedic framing of allowing a character to advocate for a position while surrounding that advocacy with absurdist humor. The episode aired on Fox without significant incident in the United States, where it was received as one of several episodes in which the show engaged with drug policy debates. In Venezuela, the reaction was very different. Venezuela's justice minister at the time responded to the episode by publicly accusing it of promoting drug use to children and to the general population. Cable stations operating in Venezuela were warned by government officials that they would face fines if they continued to air the show. Family Guy was effectively banned from Venezuelan cable networks in the aftermath of the episode. This is a remarkable thing when you sit with it for a moment. An animated comedy from the United States about a talking dog and his human family caused a foreign government to take formal regulatory action against broadcasting networks and to issue warnings about the content's influence on its citizens. The show, which had been battling with the FCC in its own country for years over what it was allowed to say on television, had simultaneously generated a completely separate international controversy of a different kind entirely, one that resulted in an actual effective broadcast ban in a sovereign nation. The Venezuelan situation is unusual in its specificity and in the formal government response it generated, but it is not isolated. The show has generated significant controversy and complaints across Western Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom and in Germany, though those controversies have generally not resulted in formal broadcast restrictions. The show has generated protests from Catholic organizations in multiple countries over episodes that touch on religion. It has generated protests from disability rights organizations over its depictions of characters with disabilities. It has generated protests from organizations representing virtually every identifiable group that the show has ever made a joke about, which, given the breadth of the show's satirical targets, is a very large number of organizations. What is interesting about mapping the show's international controversies against its domestic ones is how different the specific flashpoints are. The FCC's concerns about Family Guy were primarily about sexual content and profanity, about the kind of language and imagery that broadcast standards in the United States consider inappropriate for general audiences. The Venezuelan government's concern was about drug policy messaging. The various religious organizations' concerns were about blasphemy and disrespect for religious traditions. The disability rights organizations' concerns were about how disability was depicted and what comedy was being made at the expense of people with disabilities. These are genuinely different concerns. and they illuminate different dimensions of what the show was doing. A show that generates this range of responses from this range of different perspectives is a show that is touching something real in a lot of different places. The breadth of the international controversy around Family Guy is, in a strange way, evidence of the show's genuine cultural significance. You do not generate government responses in multiple countries and formal regulatory proceedings in your home country if you are not doing something that matters enough to provoke those responses. The show understood this about itself. MacFarlane has spoken in interviews about the relationship between controversy and significance, about how a comedy that provokes nobody is a comedy that is not saying anything worth hearing. The controversies, domestic and international, were not incidental to the show's identity. They were, in important respects, a confirmation of that identity. The show was doing exactly what it was designed to do, pushing against the places where cultural comfort ends and genuine challenge begins. The animation changes, and what they tell the eye. There is a dimension of Family Guy's history that gets much less attention in discussions of the show's evolution than the writing, the characters, and the content controversies, and that is the show's visual history. The way the show looks has changed significantly across its run, and those visual changes track the show's broader trajectory in ways that are worth paying attention to. The original 3 seasons of Family Guy had a particular visual quality that fans and critics have consistently described as having a scrappier, more hand-drawn feel to it. The characters moved in ways that were slightly looser, slightly more expressive, slightly less controlled than they would become in later seasons. The animation had a kind of energy to it that came from its imperfections as much as from its craft. When Peter fell downstairs, the fall looked like a specific kind of fall that had been specifically designed and animated by a person who was making choices about how that fall should feel comedically. When Stewie built a weapon in his bedroom, the machinery had the quality of something genuinely imagined and then drawn, rather than of something designed according to an established visual formula. Different animation studios handled different seasons of the show, and the differences between those studios' work are visible to anyone who pays close attention. Rough Draft Studios handled the animation for seasons 2 and 3, and their work is particularly well regarded by fans of the show's early period. The character movements in those seasons have a kind of lived-in quality that later seasons, with their cleaner and more controlled animation, do not quite achieve. When the show came back from cancellation in 2005 for season 4, the animation was visibly different. It was cleaner, more polished, more technically precise. The outlines on the characters became thicker and more consistent. The movements became more controlled and less loose. The overall look of the show became more professionalized in a way that also made it feel slightly more generic. The rough edges that had given the early seasons their particular energy were smoothed away, and what replaced them was technically competent but emotionally less distinctive. This pattern, more technical polish at the cost of expressive energy, continued across the show's run. By the middle seasons, the animation had become extremely consistent, which is another way of saying it had become quite predictable. You always knew how a character would move, how a reaction shot would be timed, how a physical gag would be executed. The show had developed what might be called a house style, a set of established visual rhythms that were efficient and professional, and that no longer contained much that was surprising to a viewer who had been watching for a few seasons. The extended running gags that the later seasons became famous for, the knee injury gag, the Conway Twitty segments, the various extended music numbers, existed partly because the animation for those segments could be recycled or kept extremely simple, which kept production costs down. A static shot of Peter making a noise while holding his knee requires much less animation work than a fully choreographed physical comedy sequence. An extended musical performance using archival footage requires essentially no new animation at all. These were efficient production choices that also, incidentally, represented a shift away from the kind of active, energetic physical comedy that had characterized the show in its best periods. The way a show is drawn communicates something about the energy and attention the people making it are bringing to the work. The early seasons of Family Guy looked like they were made by people who were excited about what they were creating, who were finding new things to say with the visual vocabulary they were working in. The later seasons looked like they were made by people who knew exactly how to make Family Guy, which is different from being excited about making it. The professionalism was real, the craft was real, but the energy, The sense that something surprising and alive was happening in the frame, that was harder to find. Section 19. The forgotten characters and the ecosystem of the show. Family Guy is most often discussed through the lens of its main family, the Griffins, and their immediate neighbors and friends. But the show has, across 25-plus seasons, built an entire ecosystem of recurring characters and locations that form their own kind of history, and some of the most interesting stories about the show's evolution over time are told through what happened to those peripheral characters. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the real Adam West, was a recurring presence in the show from its very early seasons. The character was a beautifully constructed absurdist figure, a version of Adam West's public persona pushed to its most eccentric and unpredictable extremes. Mayor West would do and say things that made absolutely no logical sense in the context of the scene he was in, and the comedy came entirely from the commitment with which Adam West delivered these non-sequiturs. The character became one of the show's most beloved supporting figures precisely because of his unpredictability and because of the genuine pleasure that West seemed to take in the role. When Adam West died in June 2017, the show handled his passing by writing Mayor West out of the narrative with a genuine funeral episode that served as a tribute to the actor. The episode was called Adam West High, and it depicted the town renaming the local high school in honor of the departed mayor. This was one of the show's more graceful moments in its later seasons, an episode that managed to be genuinely touching without abandoning the show's comedic identity, and that acknowledged the loss of West as both a character and a performer in a way that felt respectful. Cleveland Brown's departure from the show to anchor his own spin-off, The Cleveland Show, was handled differently, though it was a similarly significant change to the show's ecosystem. Cleveland had been one of the four central friends, a constant presence in the bar scenes and the group adventures that formed much of the show's social architecture. When he left for his own show, the group dynamic shifted. Joe Swanson and Quagmire remained, but the social geometry changed in ways that were never quite fully resolved. The Cleveland Show ran for 4 seasons before being canceled, and Cleveland eventually returned to Family Guy, but the years of his absence had altered the show's rhythm in ways that his return did not entirely undo. Meg's various attempts at having something resembling a normal social life provide one of the show's most consistent secondary narratives across its middle seasons. The parade of boyfriends and crushes and social aspirations that the show gave Meg, only to undercut all of them with the same basic joke that Meg is undesirable and her attempts at connection are inevitably pathetic, reads differently depending on which version of the Meg theory you are operating with. If Meg is the sanest character on the show, then her persistent efforts to connect with people despite everything working against her are genuinely admirable. If Meg is the show's punching bag, then those efforts are just the setup for the next joke at her expense. The show itself seems to have held both readings simultaneously without resolving the tension between them, which is perhaps why Meg remained such an interesting character to think about even when the show was treating her most carelessly. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends gather, is worth a moment of attention as a location that carries a significant portion of the show's social history. In the early seasons, the scenes at the Drunken Clam had a warmth to them that came from the genuine sense of friendship between the 4 regulars. Peter, Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire were not just people who happened to be at the same bar. They were people who clearly enjoyed each other's company, who listened to each other, who had the kind of easy shorthand that comes from years of shared experience. Their conversations had a naturalness to them that made the bar feel like a real place where real friendships existed. As the seasons progressed and the characters became more extreme versions of themselves, the Drunken Clam scenes changed. The warmth was replaced by something edgier and less comfortable. The conversations became more likely to feature one character saying something terrible to another character, or Peter doing something reckless that the others then had to respond to, or the group dynamics reflecting the increasing cruelty that had come to define Peter's character in particular. The bar was still there. The 4 of them were still meeting there. But what they were doing there felt different from what they had been doing there in the show's early seasons. Section 20. The chicken fights and what they represent. Among all the recurring elements in Family Guy's history, few have attracted more analysis or more genuine admiration than the extended battles between Peter Griffin and the Ernie the Giant Chicken. These fights, which appear roughly once every 2 to 3 seasons throughout the show's run, are unlike almost anything else the show produces. They are elaborate, extended, visually inventive action sequences in which Peter and the chicken do significant damage to each other and to every environment they pass through in a fight that escalates far beyond any conceivable real-world motivation and that resolves, temporarily, before the next one begins for equally unclear reasons. The first chicken fight appeared in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, in which a chicken who had given Peter an expired coupon for a free meal sparked a feud that resulted in an extended battle across multiple locations. The fight was funny because of its absurd escalation, because of the commitment with which the show depicted it as a genuine action sequence despite the complete absurdity of its premise, and because of the way it returned Peter and the chicken to their normal lives at the end, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The subsequent chicken fights, appearing across many seasons at irregular intervals, each tried to top the previous one in terms of scale, absurdity, and visual invention. They brought in new settings, new twists, new levels of escalation. One fight expanded to involve the chicken's entire family, and then Peter's entire family. Another fight took place in space. The fights became a kind of ongoing project within the show, a periodic reminder that the show was capable of genuine creative ambition when it chose to apply that ambition to something. The chicken fights are one of the elements of the show that fans who are otherwise critical of the later seasons tend to still point to as evidence that the show had not lost everything. They require genuine creative investment. They cannot be produced cheaply or lazily. Each one represents a real commitment of time and animation resources and creative thought to something that is, on its face, completely ridiculous. The show's willingness to keep investing in these sequences, to keep treating the ongoing battle between Peter Griffin and a chicken as something worth putting real production value into, is one of the clearest signs of a creative culture that retained some of its original ambitions, even as other aspects of the show drifted. The chicken fights also function as a kind of argument about the nature of the show's humor. They are funny in a way that is fundamentally different from the way the cutaway gags are funny. The cutaway gags are funny through randomness, through the juxtaposition of unexpected elements, through the speed of the setup and payoff. The chicken fights are funny through commitment, through the complete seriousness with which they are executed, through the way the show treats an objectively absurd situation as if it were a genuine action sequence deserving of genuine production values. These are two entirely different comedic philosophies, and the show employed both simultaneously throughout its run. The fact that the chicken fights remained genuinely creative and genuinely surprising right up through the show's most recent seasons is interesting in the context of everything else we have discussed. The cutaway gags became longer, lazier, more disconnected from the shows around them. The characters became more extreme versions of themselves in ways that drained them of complexity. The stories became thinner and less connected. But the chicken fights remained a creative bright spot, an area where the show consistently brought something that felt genuinely invested and genuinely inventive. It is as if the people making the show had collectively decided that this one specific thing deserved to be protected from the entropy that was affecting everything else. Section 21. The show's relationship with its own past. One of the most distinctive features of Family Guy's later seasons is the degree to which the show became self-referential about its own history and its own quality. Characters regularly broke the fourth wall to comment on the show's declining ratings, on the repetitiveness of its jokes, on the tired quality of certain recurring elements. The show made jokes about its own spin-offs. It made jokes about having been canceled and brought back. It made jokes about the Conway Twitty gags and about the extended knee injury gag, essentially acknowledging that those things were lazy while continuing to do them. This kind of self-aware meta-commentary became a significant feature of the show from roughly Season 8 onward, and it generates genuinely interesting questions about what it accomplishes. On one level, it functions as a form of preemptive self-criticism. By making jokes about its own problems, the show was acknowledging those problems in a way that anticipated and partially diffused the criticism of outside viewers. You cannot be surprised that a show is aware of its own repetitiveness when the show has been making jokes about that repetitiveness for years. On another level, though, the meta-commentary created a strange kind of moral hazard. If the show acknowledged that the Conway Twitty gags were lazy, it did not thereby become less lazy for continuing to use them. If characters joked about the show's declining quality, those jokes did not constitute an improvement in quality. The self-awareness was real, but it was also, in a sense, a substitute for the kind of genuine creative engagement that might have actually addressed the problems being joked about. MacFarlane himself, in interviews, demonstrated a similar self-awareness about the show. He has spoken candidly about the show's long run and about the challenges of maintaining quality across that run. He has acknowledged the criticisms that fans and critics have made. He has not been defensive about the ways the show has changed, or about the distance between the show as it currently exists and the show as it was at its best. This candor is, in its own way, admirable. It is more honest than the usual industry posture of claiming that everything has stayed equally good throughout. But candor about a problem and the correction of a problem are different things. The show spent years being aware of its own weaknesses without addressing them, which is a particular kind of creative situation that is difficult to fully understand from the outside. It suggests a production culture that had lost the ability, or perhaps the incentive, to translate self-knowledge into self-improvement. The writers knew what was wrong. The show's creator knew what was wrong. The audience knew what was wrong, and the show kept doing it anyway. The most interesting moment of this self-referential tendency might be a Season 10 episode called Back to the Pilot, in which Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the events of the very first episode of the show, and find that the animation looks different, the humor feels different, and the characters behave differently from how they do in the present. The episode is, among other things, a meditation on what the show has lost over the years, delivered in the form of a time travel adventure. The original pilot versions of the characters are depicted as looser, less controlled, more energetic. The present-day versions of the characters, visiting from a decade in the future, observe all of this, and the show leaves the audience to draw their own conclusions about what those observations mean. It is a genuinely thoughtful episode, one that demonstrates the show's capacity for self-examination, even in periods where that capacity was not being regularly exercised. It acknowledged the loss that had occurred over the show's run without quite being able to articulate why that loss had happened or what might be done about it, which is perhaps the most honest thing a show can do about its own decline. Notice it, examine it carefully, and then admit that you do not entirely know how to undo it. Section 22. The cultural impact and the legacy question. When you step back from the individual controversies and the specific episodes and the theories about what the show is secretly about, and when you try to assess what Family Guy's actual cultural impact has been across its 25-plus-year run, the picture is surprisingly complicated. The show was enormously influential. The show changed things, and the nature of what it changed is not always what its admirers or its critics claim. The most direct claim about Family Guy's cultural influence is that it popularized a specific comedic format, the cutaway gag, in a way that changed how animated comedy was written for years afterward. This is substantially true, though with important nuances. The cutaway format was not invented by Family Guy. Non-sequitur gags and rapid-fire comedic interruptions have a history in comedy that predates the show by many decades. But Family Guy made them central to its identity in a way that proved enormously popular, and the show's success created a model that other animated comedies, and eventually some live-action comedies, followed. The consequence of this influence is visible across the landscape of animated television that came after Family Guy's revival. Shows that adopted the cutaway format, the quick joke interrupting a scene, the random reference replacing a joke grounded in character, appeared throughout the late 2000s and into the 2010s. Some of these shows used the format well. Others used it as a crutch in exactly the way that critics had accused Family Guy itself of doing. The format's weakness, its tendency to substitute random disconnection for genuine comedic structure, became more visible as more shows adopted it, and as the more skillful applications became easier to distinguish from the less skillful ones. Family Guy's influence on the cultural conversation around what animated comedy for adults was allowed to do and say is perhaps even more significant than its formal influence on comedic structure. Before Family Guy's success in the late 1990s, The Simpsons was the dominant model for what animated comedy aimed at adult audiences could look like. The Simpsons had proven that animation was a legitimate medium for sophisticated storytelling and for satirical commentary on American culture. But The Simpsons operated within fairly clear limits about how far that satire could go and what kinds of content it could include. Family Guy pushed those limits significantly further, and the commercial success it achieved by doing so changed the calculations that television networks made about what animated comedies for adults were allowed to contain. South Park had already been doing this on cable television, in a context where cable's different regulatory environment gave it freedoms that broadcast television did not have. Family Guy did it on broadcast television, and the fact that it could sustain large audiences while doing so on a major network changed the terms of what was commercially viable in broadcast animated comedy. The generation of animated comedies that came after Family Guy grew up in a landscape that Family Guy had helped create, a landscape where explicit language, sexual humor, graphic violence in a comedic context, and direct satirical engagement with political and cultural subjects were all understood to be viable on broadcast television in a way they had not been before. American Dad, which shares Family Guy's creator and many of its creative genetics, was shaped by what Family Guy had established as possible. Bob's Burgers emerged in a context that Family Guy had helped create. Even shows that are stylistically very different from Family Guy, shows that deliberately rejected the cutaway format and the shock value approach, were defining themselves against a landscape that Family Guy had altered. The legacy question is ultimately not one about whether Family Guy changed American comedy, because it clearly did. The legacy question is about whether the changes it created were on balance beneficial or not, and about what those changes cost versus what they produced. The show expanded what was possible in broadcast animated comedy. It also produced a large number of imitators that adopted its weakest features without its strongest ones. It created a commercial model that incentivized shock over craft and randomness over structure. It demonstrated that large audiences would watch animated comedy that was genuinely transgressive, which was a valuable demonstration. It also demonstrated that those same large audiences would continue watching even as the quality of that comedy declined significantly, which had its own complex consequences for the culture of television production. The early seasons of Family Guy, the 3 seasons from 1999 to 2002, stand on their own as a genuinely important creative contribution to American comedy. They are funny in the way that the best comedy is funny, not just because they deliver jokes, but because they have something to say and have found an original and effective way to say it. The characters in those seasons feel like real people, even when they are doing completely impossible things, which is the fundamental achievement of good cartoon characterization. The humor has intelligence behind it even when it is being deliberately stupid, which is the mark of a writing room that knows what it is doing. That early work remains, and it remains good. The decades of subsequent content do not erase it. The controversies and the banned episodes and the production machine and the declining ratings and the departure of the creator from active creative involvement, none of that reaches back through time to make the early seasons worse than they were. They are what they are, preserved in the archive, available to anyone who wants to find them. Section 23. The Road to Episodes and the Partnership that Defined a Show. Among all the elements of Family Guy's specific creative identity, the Road to Episodes represents something genuinely unusual, a recurring format that maintained its quality and its creative freshness across a much larger span of the show's run than almost anything else in the catalog. While the main family storylines became more extreme and less grounded, while the cutaway gags grew longer and less connected to anything, while the show's emotional temperature cooled from warmth to something closer to contempt, the Road to Episodes remained consistently engaging throughout the periods when the show around them was declining. The format began in Season 2 with Road to Rhode Island, in which Brian and Stewie are stranded in the American South after a trip goes wrong and have to make their way back to Rhode Island together. The episode established a template that would be returned to throughout the show's run. Brian and Stewie, separated from the rest of the family, making their way through an unusual situation while their specific dynamic, the dry adult intellect of Brian alongside the precocious intensity of Stewie, generated comedy and occasional genuine warmth. The Road to Episodes worked for a simple reason. They took the show's 2 most interesting characters and gave them extended time together in situations that forced them to depend on each other. Brian and Stewie's friendship is one of the genuinely successful character relationships the show developed, and it survived the Flanderization of both characters better than almost any other relationship in the show, because the friendship itself seemed to bring out versions of both characters that were closer to their original selves than what appeared in the main family storylines. Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to Germany, Road to the Multiverse, Road to the North Pole, and the subsequent entries in the series each used the format to create something that felt genuinely distinct from the standard Family Guy episode. The musical numbers that appeared in many of them, often written specifically for each episode rather than lifted from other sources, showed a commitment to craft that the show's main storylines were increasingly failing to demonstrate. The emotional notes that the best of them hit, the moments when Brian and Stewie's genuine affection for each other broke through the comedy, showed the show's capacity for warmth that the main family storylines had largely abandoned. The Road 2 episodes are a useful case study in what the show was capable of when it committed to doing something well. They represent one corner of the show's creative output where quality was consistently maintained even as the overall quality of the show's production declined across seasons. They are the evidence that the people making the show in its later years retained the ability to produce something genuinely good when they chose to bring that ability to bear on a specific creative problem. They also illuminate, by contrast, the question of why that ability was not being applied more broadly. If the writing room could produce the Road 2 episodes throughout the show's middle and late seasons, it was not because they lacked the talent to produce quality content in general. The talent was there. The question was about what that talent was being directed toward, and why so much of the show's production was pointing in directions that produced content that was significantly less good than what the same writers were capable of producing. Section 24. The American Dad Comparison and What It Proves. One of the most damning pieces of evidence about the nature of Family Guy's decline is not something that the show itself produced. It is a comparison. Specifically, it is the comparison between Family Guy and American Dad, the show that Seth MacFarlane created and launched in the same year as Family Guy's revival, and that has, over time, quietly become the better show. American Dad premiered on the 6th of February 2005, just months before Family Guy's return for its fourth season. It was created by MacFarlane, along with co-creators Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, and it followed the Smith family, led by Stan Smith, a conservative CIA agent living in Langley Falls, Virginia, with his wife Francine, their kids Haley and Steve, an alien named Roger who lived in their attic, and a goldfish named Klaus, whose brain had been transplanted into a fish's body by the CIA. The show was initially received as a lesser version of Family Guy, a spin-off that lacked the original's energy and cultural presence. Critics and audiences were lukewarm. Nobody was calling American Dad the better show in 2005. The key structural difference between the two shows is that American Dad does not use cutaway gags. This is a seemingly small creative choice that has enormous downstream consequences. Without cutaway gags to fill time and to substitute for comedic structure, the writers of American Dad were forced to make every episode work as an actual story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every joke had to come from the characters and the situations they were in. Every funny moment had to be earned through the plot. This constraint forced the writing staff to become better storytellers, and over time, it produced a show that is simply more satisfying to watch from start to finish. The characters on American Dad also avoided the worst of the Flanderization that damaged Family Guy's cast. Stan Smith started as a one-dimensional political caricature, but was allowed to grow into a complex character who was stubborn and often wrong, but also genuinely loved his family and was capable of real change. He made mistakes and sometimes learned from them. He had episodes where he was the hero and episodes where he was the villain, and both felt natural because the writers had built a character who was complicated enough to be both. Roger the Alien became one of the most beloved characters in animated television precisely because the concept behind him was designed to be endlessly generative. Roger could adopt different personas, becoming entirely different characters with different names and different personalities and different backstories in different episodes. This gave the writers an infinite well of material to draw from. Every episode could feature a new version of Roger, each more absurd than the last, and it never got stale because the concept itself was designed to constantly evolve and produce new material. The show's willingness to commit to actual consequences, to let events in one episode affect events in later episodes, to allow characters to change in ways that persist beyond the episode that caused the change, gives American Dad a solidity that Family Guy in its later seasons entirely lacked. When something important happens on American Dad, it tends to matter. When something important happens on Family Guy, it tends to be reset by the following week. The fact that both shows share the same creator makes the comparison especially pointed. McFarlane's creative fingerprints are visible on both shows. The sensibility that animates both of them is recognizably the same sensibility. And yet one show maintained its quality and the other declined significantly. The difference is not in the creator. It is in the specific creative choices that were made by the people running each show, and in the structural decisions that were built into the show's formats from the beginning. American Dad chose not to use cutaway gags, a decision that forced better storytelling. American Dad's showrunners made decisions about character that protected the show's core relationships while allowing room for growth and change. American Dad built in a concept, Roger's personas, that was designed to generate fresh material indefinitely rather than depleting itself through repetition. These were good creative decisions. Family Guy made different decisions, and those decisions had different consequences. The American Dad comparison is important because it eliminates the most common excuse for Family Guy's decline. The usual argument is that any show will inevitably decline after 20-plus years, that creative fatigue is unavoidable, that no comedy can stay fresh for that long. And there is some truth to that. But American Dad has been running for roughly the same amount of time and has not suffered anything like the same catastrophic decline. It proves that longevity alone does not doom a show. What dooms a show is the choices that are made along the way. Family Guy made choices that led to where it ended up. They were not the only choices available. Section 25. The fan community and the archaeology of the show. One of the more remarkable things about Family Guy's cultural presence is the size and the dedication of the fan community that has grown up around the show, and the specific ways in which that community has engaged with the show's history and its hidden dimensions. The people who document the differences between broadcast versions and DVD versions, who track down original broadcast recordings to compare against the edited versions that appear on DVD and streaming platforms, who build archives of cutscenes and deleted material and modified content, have produced something genuinely valuable, a detailed record of the show's actual history that is significantly more complete than the official record that Fox and Disney maintain and make available. This archival work matters because the show's history includes a significant number of moments where the official version of events is not the complete version of events. The Osama bin Laden gag removed from Road to Rhode Island is one example. The Twin Towers removed from background skylines are others. The various scenes cut from episodes between their broadcast and their DVD release are others. The original lyric of I Need a Jew as it appeared on the DVD versus as it appeared on broadcast is another. Each of these represents a place where the official record, what is available on streaming platforms, what is sold as the canonical version of the show, is different from what actually aired or what was originally produced. The fan archivists who maintain the original broadcast recordings are, in a genuine sense, preserving the actual history of the show against the ongoing work of revision and management that the show's owners perform on its catalog. They are maintaining access to the thing that was actually made versus the thing that the institution would prefer you to see. The fan theory community represents a different but related form of engagement with the show. The Peter in a psychiatric facility theory, the Meg as sanest character theory, the Stewie as ghost theory, and the dozens of other theories that circulate in fan communities are all attempts to make deeper sense of a show that rewards that kind of deep engagement. They are evidence that the show, at its best, created characters and situations complex enough to generate genuine interpretive activity in the minds of its viewers. The most sophisticated fan theories about Family Guy are not really about Family Guy. They are about the questions that Family Guy raises, in sometimes accidental and sometimes intentional ways, about the American family, about dysfunction and love and the way those things coexist, about the relationship between who we want to be and who we manage to be. The show, even in its most cartoonish moments, was always circling around those questions. The fan theories are the audience trying to articulate what they have been feeling as they watched. The fact that these theories exist, that they are sophisticated and carefully constructed and draw on detailed knowledge of the show's 25-year history, is its own kind of tribute to what the show managed to do at its best. You do not build elaborate theories about shows that do not matter to you. You do not spend years thinking carefully about the internal logic of characters in a show that has not gotten under your skin in some way. The fan community, the archivists and the theorists and the people who remember the exact episode and the exact line and the exact thing about the early seasons that made them great, is evidence of genuine cultural connection. The show connected with people in ways that lasted, in ways that generated ongoing engagement years and decades after the viewing experience itself. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Section 26. The final chapter and what we are watching. Family Guy is currently in what might be its final chapter, though final chapters in television tend to last longer than anyone expects. The show has been renewed through season 27, which will take it to the 2028 to 2029 television season and to its 30th anniversary. Whether it reaches that milestone and then ends, or whether the franchise continues in some form beyond that point, is not yet known. What is known is that the commercial infrastructure that keeps the show in production remains intact, and that the people with the authority to decide whether the show continues have consistently chosen to continue it. The show that will complete its run, whenever it completes it, will be a different show in some important ways from the show that premiered in 1999. Not just because it is older, and not just because the characters have changed, but because the cultural moment it was born in and the cultural moment it will end in are genuinely different, and because the show's relationship with its own creator and with the network it airs on has genuinely changed. McFarlane is in a different place in his career and his life than he was when he was a 2-4-year-old animator making short films about a guy named Larry and his dog Steve, films that would eventually become the seed of the entire Griffin family. He has accomplished more than anyone in 1999 would have predicted was possible from that seed. The world he was trying to say something about in those early episodes is still there, still recognizable, still generating the same basic human experiences of family dysfunction and aspiration and failure and love that the Griffin family was always, at bottom, trying to dramatize. Whether the show has anything left to say about that world, or whether it has been saying the same things for so long that the capacity to say them freshly has been used up, is something that only the people making it can really know from the inside, and perhaps something that even they cannot always clearly see. What is clear, watching from the outside, is that the show's history is richer and stranger and more complicated than its surface suggests. The banned episodes tell a story about institutional power and political risk. The real-world coincidences tell a story about the permeability of the boundary between fiction and reality. The fan theories tell a story about what audiences do with cultural objects they love, how they transform them through interpretation into something that reflects their own deepest questions. The production history tells a story about what happens to creative work when it becomes a commercial product, about the tensions between artistic intent and institutional momentum, about the ways that the system of broadcast television both enables and constrains the art that is made within it. All of that is the show, even though none of it is in any specific episode. The show is the episodes and the context that surrounds them, and the history that produced them, and the theories that try to make sense of them, and the archive that preserves what the official record has tried to revise away. It is all of those things together, and it is more interesting as all of those things together than it is as any single one of them. The house on Spooner Street is still lit from within. The show is still running. The forbidden episodes are still sitting in their various states of availability and inaccessibility. The theories are still being developed and revised and debated. The archive is still being maintained by the people who care enough to maintain it. And somewhere in all of that, the early seasons are still exactly what they always were. Funny and sharp and warm and original. A piece of television that said something specific and true about the American family in a moment when that needed to be said, and that said it in a way that nobody had said it quite like before. That is what lasts. That is what stays. When everything else, the controversies and the ratings and the corporate deals and the production machinery, eventually settles into the past. The thing that was actually good, the thing that was actually true, the thing that actually connected, that has always been worth looking for, and that is always worth finding. If this found you in the dark tonight and kept you company for a while, a like and a subscribe mean more than you might think. And leave a comment, tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I will be reading them. See you in the next one. Section 27. The Parents Television Council and the War That Shaped the Show. No external organization shaped Family Guy's creative history more than the Parents Television Council, and yet the relationship between the show and that organization is rarely discussed in the depth it deserves. The Parents Television Council was founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III, and its stated mission was to promote and restore responsibility and decency to the entertainment industry. In practice, this meant organizing campaigns against television content the organization deemed harmful to families and children, filing complaints with the FCC, pressuring advertisers to withdraw sponsorship from shows it targeted, and generating media coverage that kept the conversation about television content standards alive in public discourse. Family Guy was named the Worst TV Show of the Week by the Parents Television Council on at least 40 separate documented occasions across the show's run, which is a remarkable number when you consider that this represents a sustained, multi-year campaign of organized opposition to a single television program. The organization filed multiple formal complaints with the FCC specifically about Family Guy episodes, contributing to the regulatory pressure that resulted in proposed fines against Fox and its affiliates. They maintained a running list of objectionable content from the show, updated regularly, that cataloged specific moments, lines of dialogue, and visual gags that they considered particularly harmful. The show responded to this attention in the way it responded to most things, by making jokes about it. The Parents Television Council appeared as a named organization in several episodes. Individual episodes were constructed partly as responses to the organization's complaints. The creative tension between what the show wanted to do and what the Parents Television Council was trying to prevent it from doing became a kind of ongoing creative fuel for the writing room. McFarlane's comments about the Parents Television Council across various interviews over the years revealed genuine frustration with what he saw as the organization's mischaracterization of the show's content and its effects. He argued that the organized complaint campaigns the organization ran did not represent genuine widespread public outrage, but rather the coordinated efforts of a relatively small and ideologically motivated group. He pointed to the show's large audience as evidence that most viewers did not share the organization's concerns. He argued that the FCC's responsiveness to organized complaint campaigns, rather than to genuine measures of audience preference or harm, represented a structural problem in how broadcast content regulation worked. The FCC did, in fact, ultimately dismiss most of the complaints that the Parents Television Council had filed against Family Guy. The proposed fines that reached as high as $1.2 million against Fox for specific Family Guy content were challenged by Fox and eventually reduced or eliminated. The regulatory process that was supposed to hold the show accountable for its content largely failed to do so in any lasting way. But the organization's campaigns against the show had real effects even when they failed to achieve their stated goals. The campaigns kept the show's content under heightened scrutiny, which almost certainly caused Fox's Standards and Practices Department to be more conservative in what they allowed the show to produce than they would have been without that external pressure. The campaigns contributed to the climate that made partial terms of endearment unbroadcastable in the United States, not because the campaign specifically targeted that episode, but because they had created a general environment in which anything that might generate organized complaint carried significantly higher institutional risk for the network. The Parents Television Council's campaign against Family Guy is, in retrospect, one of the most interesting chapters in the show's history because it represents a genuine clash of competing ideas about what public communication is for and who gets to decide what it contains. The organization believed it was protecting families and children. The show believed it was exercising legitimate creative and satirical freedom. The regulatory system tried to adjudicate between these positions and mostly failed to satisfy anyone completely. The advertisers who were occasionally pressured to withdraw from the show by the organization's campaigns were caught in the middle of a cultural argument that had little to do with the products they were selling. What the entire arc of the Parents Television Council's campaign against Family Guy ultimately demonstrates is that organized opposition to specific content, even when that opposition is substantial and sustained, has limited ability to actually change what creators produce when those creators have institutional support and large audiences. The show was not tamed by the campaigns against it. If anything, the awareness that it was being watched and complained about energized the writing room to be more provocative, not less. Section 28. The music and the songs that surprised everyone. Family Guy has always had music at its heart, in a way that distinguishes it from most animated comedies, And the show's musical history is rich enough and interesting enough to deserve its own section in any serious account of what the show has been across its run. McFarlane is a genuinely talented musician and singer, in addition to being a comedian and television producer. His albums of big band and jazz standards, recorded in the style of classic Capitol Records era performers, have sold well and received critical respect in a genre where credibility is hard to earn. This musical talent informed the show from its earliest episodes, and the quality of Family Guy's original songs has consistently been one of the show's most reliable creative assets. The songs in the early seasons of the show were extraordinary by any standard for broadcast television comedy. The Bird is the Word, technically a cover of a 1963 Trashman song rather than an original composition, became one of the most shared clips from the show in the YouTube era because of the perfect comedic timing of its use and the way the show committed to running it far longer than any reasonable person would expect, creating comedy through sheer commitment to an absurd premise. But the original songs were even more impressive. I Need a Jew. The song at the center of the When You Wish Upon a Weinstein controversy is actually a remarkably well-crafted piece of musical comedy. The decision to use the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star is not random. The original song is about hoping for something magical to solve your problems, and Peter's version is about the same thing, just with a specific ethnic group substituted for a wishing star. The parody works because the original song is chosen with precision, because the contrast between the song's aspirational warmth and the content Peter is putting into it is exactly calibrated to produce the kind of uncomfortable laughter that good satirical comedy aims for. The FCC song from the PTV episode is another example of the show's musical ambition translating into something genuinely impressive. The song is catchy, the lyrics are precise, the comedic timing of the musical arrangement is excellent, and the argument being made through the song that censorship is overreach is communicated clearly and memorably through the musical form in a way that a straight dialogue scene could not have achieved as efficiently. The Road 2 episodes consistently featured original musical numbers of genuine quality. Christmas Time is Killing Us from Road to the North Pole is a darkly funny meditation on the commercial pressures around Christmas that holds up as a piece of songwriting independent of its animated context. You and I Are So Awfully Different from Road to Germany is a remarkably touching song about an unlikely friendship that hits emotional notes. The show's dialogue sections rarely reached. The musical numbers in Family Guy represent one of the clearest examples of the show applying genuine craft and genuine ambition to a specific aspect of its production. The songs were consistently better than the show strictly needed them to be. They were better than most of the rest of the show in many seasons. They demonstrated, in the way that the Road 2 episodes demonstrated and the chicken fights demonstrated, that the people making the show retained the ability to produce something excellent when they chose to fully commit to doing it well. McFarlane's musical talent shaped the show in less obvious ways as well. The show's use of pop songs and standards as scoring, the way specific songs from the American popular music catalog were chosen to accompany specific emotional beats, reflected a genuine musicality in the show's creative sensibility that was present from the beginning. The show understood that music could deepen a comedic moment, could make a joke land harder or cut more precisely, could add layers of meaning to a scene that the dialogue and the images alone could not achieve. This musical intelligence is part of what gave the early seasons of Family Guy their particular texture, and it is something that persisted even into the show's weaker periods, as one of the elements that kept the show from losing its identity entirely. You can identify a Family Guy episode within seconds, partly through its visual style and its voice performances, but also through the specific way it uses music, the specific comedic sensibility that governs how songs are deployed, and how musical timing interacts with comedic timing. Section 29. The Stewie and Brian episodes: A Complete Accounting. The creative relationship between Stewie Griffin and Brian Griffin is the most significant relationship in the show's history, and it deserves a more complete accounting than it has received in earlier sections. The development of that relationship, from the early seasons where Brian was one of the few characters who could understand Stewie at all, through the middle seasons where their friendship became the show's emotional core, and into the later seasons where that friendship was tested and complicated by the changes both characters underwent, forms a through line across the show's entire run that is more coherent and more consistently interesting than almost anything else the show produced. In the early seasons, the Stewie-Brian relationship was primarily defined by Brian's unique ability to understand and communicate with Stewie. Most adults in the show perceived Stewie as a baby making baby sounds, but Brian heard him clearly and responded to him as an equal. This created an intimacy between the two characters that was unusual and that the show used carefully. Brian was the one person in Stewie's world who took him seriously, and Stewie was, in return, one of the only figures in Brian's world who genuinely respected him. The Road to episodes, beginning in Season 2 with Road to Rhode Island, established a framework for exploring the relationship that the show returned to across many subsequent seasons. The format removed both characters from the Griffin household context that constrained them and placed them in situations where they had to rely on each other, which forced the relationship itself to be the subject of the episode rather than the background for other stories. The best of these episodes used that framework to reveal things about both characters that the standard episode format could not accommodate. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, already discussed at length in an earlier section, represents the apex of the relationship as the show was able to depict it. That episode stripped away everything except the two characters and the space between them, and what it found in that space was something genuinely moving. Two complicated individuals, neither of whom had found their place in the world, who had found something like a home in each other's company. The emotional weight of that episode came entirely from the accumulated history of the relationship, from all the seasons of Road to adventures and bar conversations and unusual situations that the two had navigated together. The death and resurrection of Brian in Season 12 was devastating to the Stewie-Brian relationship in ways that went beyond the immediate narrative. The resurrection was achieved through Stewie's willingness to risk his own timeline and his own existence in order to save Brian, which was one of the most powerful expressions of the depth of the relationship the show had ever produced. But the subsequent treatment of both characters, the return to Brian's insufferable later season persona, and Stewie's increasingly untethered storylines, failed to build on the emotional foundation that the death and resurrection had revealed. The relationship was demonstrably deep enough to motivate Stewie to rewrite history to save Brian's life. The show chose not to explore what that depth meant for how the two characters related to each other going forward. Section 30. The Long Goodbye and What Comes Next. Every long-running television show eventually faces the question of how it ends, and what kind of ending is appropriate for what it has been. For most shows, the ending comes from cancellation, which is a form of imposed conclusion rather than a chosen one. For the shows that are allowed to choose their own endings, the challenge is to find something that honors both what the show has been at its best and what the audience has invested in it over the years. Family Guy's ending, whenever it comes, faces a particular challenge that most long-running shows do not face. It will have to reckon with the distance between what the show started as and what it became. The early seasons established characters and relationships that were genuinely compelling and genuinely warm. The later seasons systematically dismantled much of that warmth and that complexity. Any ending that tries to honor what the show was at its best will need to somehow bridge that distance to find a version of these characters that can speak to the emotional investment that viewers made in the early years while acknowledging the distance traveled since then. The most honest ending for Family Guy might be one that acknowledges the show's own history of resetting and beginning again. A show that has been canceled twice and brought back twice. A show that has been canceled in the narrative, so to speak, through the character changes and the declining quality, and then briefly brought back to something like its former self. In individual episodes like Brian and Stewie or the Better Road to episodes, knows something about what it means to end and begin and end again. That knowledge could be the substance of a final episode if the people making it chose to use it. But there is also an argument for an ending that simply closes the loop on the premise. The Griffin family in the house on Spooner Street, together, imperfect, occasionally terrible to each other, and underneath all of that, still connected in ways that 25 years of story have established as real. Peter, who was always better at love than he was at expressing it without causing damage in the process. Lois, who held the whole chaotic enterprise together through sheer force of patience and practical intelligence. Meg, who chose to stay when she could have left, and who made that choice repeatedly without anyone really acknowledging what it cost her. Chris, steady and good-natured in a family that was often neither. Stewie, whatever he actually is, dangerous and frightened and fiercely loved. Brian, the smartest and most self-deceiving member of the household, doing his best. The house on Spooner Street is still lit from within. For now, the show is still running. The stories are still being told, even in the compromised form the show currently takes. And somewhere in the archive, the early seasons are still waiting, still holding the best version of what this show managed to be, still offering the thing that made 22 million people sit down after the Super Bowl in 1999 and decide they wanted more. That is what stays. That is what endures. Not the ratings, not the controversies, not the corporate renewal deals, not the banned episodes or the production budget decisions or the showrunner changes. The thing that stays is the thing that was actually good. The thing that connected. The thing that made people feel, even briefly, that they were watching something that understood something true about the world. That is always what stays. And it is always worth looking for. Section 31. Brian Griffin's 9 lives and the character who kept coming back. Brian Griffin has died multiple times across the show's run, in various forms and with various degrees of finality, and the pattern of those deaths and returns tells its own story about the show's relationship with its characters and with the audience that cares about them. The most famous death is, of course, the Season 12 Life of Brian incident, discussed extensively in an earlier section in which Brian was hit by a car and died, only to be rescued 2 episodes later by Stewie's time travel. But that was not the only time the show played with the possibility of Brian's permanent absence. In various alternate timeline episodes, in simulation sequences, in dream sequences, Brian has died and been replaced, died and been mourned, died and been forgotten, multiple times across the show's run. What this pattern reveals is that the show understood Brian to be the character whose loss would be felt most deeply by the audience, even in periods where his actual characterization had made him difficult to like. The audience's attachment to Brian was deep enough, rooted enough in the early seasons version of the character, that even the later, more insufferable Brian carried that accumulated emotional credit. The show kept returning to Brian's death as a dramatic device precisely because it knew the death would land, even when the character had not been earning that emotional investment in recent episodes. This is one of the more interesting dynamics in how long-running shows work. Characters accumulate emotional capital through the early seasons when they are written well and when audiences form genuine attachments to them. That capital can then be spent in later seasons on dramatic events that generate emotional responses proportional to the early investment rather than to the current quality of the characterization. The audience is responding to the character they remember and love, not necessarily to the character that has been appearing on screen recently. The show's repeated willingness to threaten Brian's life, or to actually end it temporarily, suggests an awareness of this dynamic and a willingness to exploit it commercially. The Season 12 death was explicitly described by the production team as designed to generate attention and ratings. The earlier deaths in alternate timelines and simulations were lower-stakes versions of the same move. Each time, the show was dipping into the emotional account that the early seasons had built up and using it to generate engagement. What makes this pattern interesting to think about is the question of what would happen if the account were finally drawn down to 0. At some point, if the show keeps threatening Brian, or killing Brian and bringing him back, the emotional impact of those moments will diminish to nothing, because the audience will have learned that nothing is permanent and nothing that happens to Brian has real consequences. The show has not quite reached that point yet, partly because the actual deaths have been rare enough and the returns have been quick enough that the pattern has not fully registered. But the direction of travel is visible, and the end point, a situation in which no event involving Brian can generate genuine emotional response, is theoretically reachable. The lesson is one about the difference between maintaining emotional investment through consistently good characterization versus exploiting existing emotional investment through dramatic manipulation. The early seasons built the investment. The later seasons have been drawing on it without replenishing it. That cannot continue indefinitely. At some point, the account runs out, and then the dramatic events no longer have the intended effect, and the show has lost not just its quality, but its ability to generate the kind of audience engagement that has kept it commercially viable long after the quality itself declined. Section 32. What the show gets right about America. In the midst of all the controversy and the declining quality, and the production machinery, and the fan theories, and the forbidden episodes, it is worth pausing to identify what Family Guy gets right about the country it depicts, and what it has consistently gotten right about that country, even when it was getting other things very wrong. The show is set in Rhode Island, a small state on the northeastern coast of the United States, and while the town of the Griffin family's fictional city is not a real place, the cultural texture of the show is distinctly and recognizably American in ways that go beyond geography. The show has always understood something true about working-class white American family life, about the specific combination of genuine love and genuine failure that characterizes households where the parents are doing their best, but their best falls significantly short of what their children need. Peter Griffin, at his best, is a genuinely recognizable figure. He is not smart, but he wants to be seen as competent. He is not a good father, but he loves his children in a way that he cannot express properly. He is not a good husband, but he needs Lois more than he knows how to say. He is the product of a working-class upbringing that gave him certain values about masculinity and family and success that he has never examined critically, because examining them critically would require a kind of self-awareness that his upbringing did not cultivate. He is a genuinely American character in the specific sense that he embodies contradictions that are recognizably American contradictions. The show at its best understood that the comedy of Peter Griffin was inseparable from the tragedy of Peter Griffin, that his buffoonery was not simply random but was rooted in specific failures of understanding and specific kinds of emotional constipation that were culturally legible and culturally real. The early seasons trusted the audience to hold both the comedy and the tragedy simultaneously, to laugh at Peter while also recognizing something true about the kind of person he was and the kind of home he was raising his children in. Lois Griffin, similarly, is a genuinely recognizable figure. She is a woman who is significantly more capable and more intelligent than her husband, who has organized her life around managing his limitations and compensating for his failures, and who has done this so consistently for so long that she has difficulty imagining what her life might look like if she had not made that organizing choice. The early seasons gave her genuine interiority, genuine frustration, genuine moments of wondering whether the bargain she had made was the right one. Later seasons flattened her, made her either a scold or a co-conspirator in the family's dysfunction, and lost the specific kind of pathos that made her interesting in the early years. What the show gets right about America, at its best, is the gap between aspiration and reality, between the family that Americans imagine they are supposed to have and the family that most Americans actually live in. The Griffins are not a good family in any conventional sense. They are disorganized, often unkind to each other, frequently irresponsible, inconsistent in their values, and collectively unable to sustain the kind of growth and change that would make them better than they are. But they are recognizably a family, in the specific sense that they are bound together by something that is not quite love in the fully articulated sense, but is also not merely proximity or convenience. That recognition, the sense that the Griffins are a specific kind of real, even though they are animated and impossible, was the show's greatest achievement. It is what made the early seasons more than just a collection of funny jokes. It is what made people care about what happened to these characters even when those characters were doing terrible things. And it is what the show has lost the most of in its later years, as the characters became more extreme and less rooted in anything recognizably human, and as the warmth that held the dysfunction together became increasingly hard to find. The warmth is still there in occasional episodes, in moments that break through the accumulated cynicism of the later seasons and remind the audience of what the show once was and what it was once capable of. Those moments are rarer than they should be, but they are not entirely absent. And each time one of them appears, it is a reminder that the show knows how to do this. It has always known how to do this. The knowledge has never left. What left was the consistent commitment to applying that knowledge to every episode rather than treating it as an occasional luxury. Section 33. The night the show changed everything. There is a specific moment in the show's history that many longtime fans point to as the moment when the show definitively crossed from one phase of its existence to another, when the accumulated changes of the revival years crystallized into something that felt irreversible. Different fans place this moment at different points. Some say it was the episode where a specific character moment was played for laughs that should not have been laughed at. Some say it was the first time a Conway Twitty number appeared in place of actual comedy. Some say it was a season 10 episode. Some say season 8. Some say it happened gradually enough that there was no single moment. What they are all describing, from different angles and with different specific examples, is the experience of watching a show you love become something you do not quite recognize. It is a particular kind of loss that is different from other kinds of loss in entertainment, because the object of the loss is still present, still there on the screen, still using the same character names and the same voices and the same family structure. But something essential has departed, and its absence is felt precisely because the surface appearance of the thing has not changed. The shows we love become part of how we understand the world and ourselves. When we watch a family sitcom, even an animated one, even a deliberately absurdist one, we are watching a story about what families are and what they mean and what they cost the people inside them. When that story changes, when the family becomes unrecognizable or the values it embodies shift in ways we did not expect, it is not just a television show that has changed. Something in the interpretive framework we were using has shifted, and the shift is disorienting in ways that can be difficult to articulate. Family Guy's core audience, the people who watched it in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when it was first establishing what it was going to be, grew up alongside the show in a specific way. The show's humor shaped their sense of what was funny. The show's characters shaped their understanding of certain kinds of family dynamics. The show's approach to cultural commentary shaped their relationship to satire and to the possibility of using comedy to say something true about the world. When the show changed, it changed for an audience that had grown up with it, that had developed real emotional attachments to it, that had come to rely on it for a specific kind of entertainment and a specific kind of understanding. The change was not just a decline in television quality, it was a disruption of something that had become genuinely meaningful to people. That is why the fan responses to things like Brian's death were so intense, and why the theories and the analyses and the long conversations about what the show once was continue to this day. The show mattered to people in ways that outlast its quality, and the loss of what it once was continues to be felt long after the moment of the loss itself. Section 34. The Final Resting Hour. Here is what we have covered in the hours we have spent together in the dark. We started with the episodes that Fox buried, the When You Wish Upon a Weinstein story, 3 years in a vault, a lawsuit, and eventually a broadcast that nobody found particularly offensive. Then Partial Terms of Endearment, still unaired in America after 15 years, sitting quietly on DVD while the political conversation around its subject has only gotten louder. Then PTV, the episode about censorship that got censored, which remains the clearest and funniest articulation of the contradiction at the heart of the show's existence on broadcast television. We followed Seth MacFarlane through the morning of the 11th of September 2001, through an airport lounge and through 10 minutes that separated him from a plane and from an ending that would have changed everything. We spent time in the bank vault with Brian and Stewie, in that half hour where the show remembered what it was capable of doing when it chose to do it. We watched the staged death and calculated resurrection of Brian Griffin and thought about what it revealed about the relationship between a show and the audience it has trained to care about it. We went through the predictions that came true, the Caitlyn Jenner line from 2009, the Kevin Spacey gag from 2005, the strange and unexplainable resonance of the Robin Williams broadcast on the 11th of August 2014. We spent time with Quagmire and the darkness underneath the joke, with the accumulated evidence of 25 years that the fan theory community has assembled into something that makes the character feel genuinely unsettling if you take it seriously. We gave Meg the attention she deserves, the theory that makes her the most human character in the show, the most consistently clear-eyed, the most willing to bear what the family requires her to bear. We worked through the darkest theory, the one that turns the entire show into the hallucination of a man in a facility trying to process a tragedy he cannot face. We followed Seth MacFarlane's departure from active creative involvement in the show he built, from the fired-up 2-4-year-old making short films about Larry and his dog Steve to the Hollywood Titan in 2024, describing his own show as a machine that generates funding for environmental causes. We looked at the numbers, the 22 million and the 723,000, and thought about what it means for something to lose 96% of its audience and still keep running. And then, in the sections that came after, we went deeper into the corners that the main story does not usually reach. The lost cuts and the archival work of the fan community, the international incidents, the animation history, the musical legacy, the comparison with American Dad that proves the decline was chosen rather than inevitable. We thought about what the show gets right about America, about the specific kind of working-class family dysfunction it has always understood, about the warmth that used to hold the dysfunction together, and about what happened to that warmth. At the end of all of it, what remains is what always remains, the thing that was actually good. The early seasons, still there in the archive, still doing what they were always doing, still saying something true about families and love and failure and the specific kinds of American hope that are always mixed up with the specific kinds of American damage. Those seasons do not need to be defended or qualified or contextualized. They are what they are. They were good. They remain good. The rest of it, the controversies and the forbidden episodes and the predictions and the theories and the production machinery and the ratings charts and the corporate deals, all of it is the surround that a piece of creative work accumulates when it becomes significant enough to matter. Significant things generate controversy. Significant things generate theories. Significant things generate the kind of passionate engagement that produces fan archives and banned episode discussions and late-night videos that people watch in the dark when the rest of the world has gone quiet. You are watching this because something in the show, or in the story of the show, connected with something in you. That connection was real and it remains real, and no amount of later seasons or declining quality or production machinery changes what it was. The house on Spooner Street is still lit from within. If this found you tonight and kept you company, a like and a subscribe are genuinely appreciated, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. These videos reach people in different parts of the world at all hours, and knowing that always means something. See you in the next one. Section 35. The Letters They Never Sent. Every long-running show accumulates a shadow history alongside its official one. The shadow history is made up of all the things the show almost did. The pitches that were rejected in the writer's room, the episode ideas that never made it past the first conversation, the character arcs that were proposed and turned down, the jokes that were cut before the table read, the endings that were written and then discarded. For Family Guy, which ran for so many seasons and went through so many shifts in creative direction and writing staff, that shadow history must be enormous. We will never know most of it. The writers' rooms of television shows are private spaces, and what gets discussed and rejected in those rooms is rarely documented in any accessible way. But occasionally, fragments emerge. An interview where a writer mentions a pitch that never happened. A DVD commentary where McFarlane or another creator talks about something they tried that the network would not allow. A table read script that surfaces in a fan archive and shows an episode that was substantially different from what eventually aired. What we know from those fragments, and from the broader pattern of the show's history, is that the show was consistently more ambitious than what finally reached broadcast. The ambitions were not always wise or well-directed. The show also had ambitions toward content that was transgressive in ways that were just cruelty rather than genuine satire, and those ambitions being reined in was probably for the better. But the creative impulse behind the show, the desire to say things that other shows would not say and to go places that other shows would not go, was consistently running ahead of what the institutional constraints of broadcast television would accommodate. The forbidden episodes represent the cases where that ambition ran far enough ahead that the result was a complete refusal to broadcast. But the entire history of the show is a negotiation between creative ambition and institutional constraint, and the show's most interesting moments are almost always the moments where that negotiation produced something surprising, something that slipped through the machinery in a form that retained more of the original intent than anyone might have expected. The letters they never sent, the episodes they never made, the stories they never told, because the network said no, or because the writer's room said the timing was not right, or because the show's own declining creative culture had lost the ability to imagine them. Those represent a kind of loss that cannot be fully accounted. What we can do is attend carefully to what did make it through, and find in those episodes and in those moments the thing that the show was always reaching for, even when it fell short. The forbidden episodes are part of that reaching. The theories are part of that reaching. The best episodes, the ones that people still talk about years later because they contained something true, are part of that reaching. The show at its best was always reaching for something real, something honest, something that would make the audience feel that they were watching a story that understood them. That reaching is the most valuable thing the show ever did. And it never entirely stopped. Even when so much else about the show was drifting in the wrong direction, the house on Spooner Street is still there. The light in the window is still on. And somewhere inside, in the archive that holds everything the show ever made, there are still episodes worth watching, still moments worth finding, still something worth the search. That is all we can ask of any long-running piece of work, that it was worth the search. Family Guy, taken whole, at its best and at its worst, and at all the complicated points in between, was worth the search. It still is. And if you look for the right things in the right places, it will be for a long time to come. If you made it to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you spending these hours here. Leave a comment, tell me where you are and what time it is, and let me know what other corners of television history you want to explore in future videos. Subscribe if you have not, because there is always more to find. See you in the next one. Section 36. A few more minutes in the dark. We are nearly at the end of this one, but before the credits roll, I want to spend just a few more minutes on something that does not get talked about often enough in conversations about Family Guy's history. And that is the simple fact of how many people the show reached, and what that reaching meant. 22 million people watched the first episode. Tens of millions more watched across the early seasons. The show got canceled, and the audience did not just move on. They bought DVDs, they watched the reruns on Adult Swim at midnight, they drove the ratings of those reruns up by 239% and turned a canceled cartoon into one of the most watched things on late-night cable television. They did that because something in the show had connected with them in a way they were not willing to let go of just because Fox had decided the show was over. That is not a small thing. That is people voting with their time and their attention for something they genuinely cared about. The show came back because of that. The revival happened because the audience refused to let the show stay canceled, which almost never happens in television, and which speaks to the depth of the connection that those early seasons had built. The fan community that gathered around the show across the years, the people who built the archives and developed the theories and wrote the long analyses and made the late-night YouTube essays, were all downstream of that original connection. They were all trying to hold on to something that the early seasons had given them, or trying to understand what had happened to it, or trying to find the version of the show that had made them feel the way they remembered feeling. That search, persistent and ongoing and sometimes frustrated and sometimes rewarded, is the most honest tribute any piece of entertainment can receive. It means the work mattered. It means it connected. It means something real was there. Family Guy, at its best, had something real in it. The best episodes still carry it. The theories circle around it. The forbidden episodes gesture toward the places where the show's reach exceeded its grasp in the most interesting ways. That is what we have been looking at all these hours. The real thing and what happened to it, and where it still lives. Thanks for being here. Leave a comment, subscribe if you have not, and I will see you in the next one.